Committee will come to order. We will continue on with our 10-minute rounds of questions, and by my list, the next person up is Senator Barrasso.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rubio, congratulations. I'm grateful for your willingness to serve our nation in this new role. Thank you as well for your family's commitment to continue with your service here to this country. I think President Trump made a wonderful choice in nominating you to be Secretary of State. Your extensive foreign policy experience and your deep understanding of international relations, I think, makes you a perfect choice for the position. While serving together in the Senate on this committee, I've seen firsthand your dedication, your knowledge, and your commitment to our nation's security. Your strategic insights, your principled approach to diplomacy, they're going to serve our nation well, and we do face many challenges. We've talked about them in the past, so you have my full and unwavering support. I wanted to start with China, because over the years we worked closely together to counter the significant threat strategy extends far beyond traditional military conflict. They're conducting an aggressive campaign aimed at weakening American leadership and reshaping the global order to serve their own interests. I think we make no mistake, China is challenging our interests all across various domains, diplomatic, economic, technological. They're playing the long game. And I think we have to respond with equal resolve and a strategy. It's essential that we fully recognize the scope of the challenge and develop a strategy to safeguard American interests and the values on the world stage. So could you talk a little bit about your approach in addressing an increasingly aggressive China and how we and our international partners can hold China accountable?
Well, and as I pointed to earlier, it's an important question because I think it's definitional to the century. I really do. I think the 21st century will be defined by what happens between the United States and China. The Chinese have basically concluded that America is sort of a tired great power in decline, that they are on a path over the next 20 or 30 years to naturally supplant us, irrespective of what happens. And I think their preference is to not have any trade and or armed conflict in the interim because I think they might interrupt what they believe is a natural progression. I don't share that view. I think they have some significant domestic challenges. Nonetheless, I do think what we can't ignore is that at the current road that we're on right now is an unbalanced relationship, and that much of their growth and their progress has come at our expense, not because they outcompeted us, but because they frankly have violated the rules that they've benefited from but have lived by none of its obligations. So I think the first begins with the recognition that China is and will continue to be a rich and powerful country, and we will have to deal with them. It's in the interest of global peace and stability that we have to deal with them. By the same token, we cannot find ourselves in a situation in which we allow them to continue to flaunt the rules in order to undermine us economically and or industrially, nor can we allow them to undermine our alliances and our presence in different parts of the world. For example, I think it is clear that on that path towards what they view as their rightful place as the world's preeminent power, they want to establish preeminence in the Indo-Pacific. And that has historical ramifications or historical underpinnings because they view these smaller countries as tributary states, that basically all roads lead back to Beijing, and they view that. Unfortunately for them, their neighbors do not view themselves as tributary states. And this is particularly true in places like South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, but also Vietnam and others, some of whom have historical disagreements with China. So at the core of our strategy has to be twofold. Number one, ensuring that there is a proper geopolitical balance between the United States and China to avoid any sort of conflict that could be deeply destabilizing and worse for the world, but at the same time ensuring that it doesn't come at our expense, that we don't find ourselves in a world in which we are dependent on China, or any foreign power for that matter, for the raw materials that we need, for the ability to make medicine, for the ability to fuel our economy, the ability to feed ourselves or our people. we cannot be a country that becomes dependent on foreign powers. And so much of that involves not simply how we engage in the world, but also what we do here domestically. That is not the responsibility of the Department of State, but it is important for us to point to that much of what's happened with China, much of what's happening now, is what we are not doing, whether it's through our own industry and the development of our own industries, or access to raw minerals and raw resources that are critical to fueling and or building a modern economy.
You talk about China playing by a different set of rules, and they do the ones that we think of as traditional rules. But and I appreciated your comments to Senator Ricketts about China and even the definition of them as a developing nation. I think it's a big problem. They can't be allowed to continue to play openly with a different set of rules. In addition to the hidden rules, I oppose China exploiting its status as a, quote, developing nation within international organizations. I think it helps them gain an additional unfair advantage in what you described as this unbalanced relationship. China is not in any way a developing country. You just mentioned they're a rich and powerful country. That's not a developing country. It's the second largest economy in the world. Clearly has the financial resources and access to capital to meet its own needs. So I think we need to end China's preferential treatment and hold it accountable on the global stage. I mean, we see it in the World Bank. We see it in other locations. Are there things that we can do and you can do as Secretary of State to try to eliminate this unfair advantage that they have? And it's an open unfair advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to, first of all, and I mentioned this in my opening statement, we have to acknowledge that many of the global institutions that were created not just in the post-war era, but the post-Cold War era have been weaponized against us. And I can use a number of examples. The first is, you think about the Security Council of the United Nations, which was created ostensibly for the purpose of preventing global conflict. Sadly, two of the greatest drivers of instability in the world today hold a veto vote at the Security Council. It's basically rendered the Security Council almost irrelevant. By the same token, I would say I am not against multilateral organizations so long as that or any foreign arrangement we have serves the national interest of the United States. I do not believe, and the President has made this abundantly clear, President Trump, that under no circumstances should any foreign entity or multilateral or international organization have veto power over the national security interests of the United States of America. The second point that I would point to is that the Chinese have very aggressively played this. They have figured out, and it isn't hard to figure out, that even the smallest nation state has a vote at the United Nations General Assembly. And they have worked hard to not just court, but entrap a handful of votes around the world, and including in our own hemisphere. If you look at the Caribbean Basin, in Grenada and places like that, where they go into these countries, and they don't just provide $1 million or $1 billion to build the stadium, they also give you $5 or $6 million under the table for your family and friends. They do that in place after place. We've seen that practice as well in Africa. So we need to understand that there has to be, in many of these parts of the world, look, we're not bribing anybody. We're not going to do that, and it's certainly illegal for American companies to do it. But it's hard to engage these countries who in many cases have legitimate needs when they say, the Chinese, we prefer to have your stuff, we prefer to have American investment, but you're not offering any, and so we're left with the only alternative, and that is to take the Chinese investment, even though it comes with strong strings attached that include things like debt diplomacy or debt traps and expectations of diplomatic cooperation at these international forums.
My final question has to do, because you used the phrase, we need to be able to fuel our economy, and I'll talk a little bit about energy. Look, people who live in foreign developing nations, they want to be able to fuel their economy as well. They need a stable energy source to grow their economy, to improve lives. Many of the countries you've traveled to and I have, we've seen what energy poverty can do to people to make it harder for them. You know, we have an ability to help these countries develop a stable energy supply. But this current administration, the Biden administration, has put restrictions in place on funding of certain energy resources, such as coal, even natural gas. The United States should be working to promote an all-of-the-above energy strategy and help our friends and allies have affordable energy as opposed to what is the politically correct type of energy to be used. So I believe we should be helping these countries with energy. And are you committed to ensuring the State Department is promoting all forms of energy projects across the globe, including oil, gas, coal, affordable energy that will help people raise their standards of living?
Yes, in fact, it should be a centerpiece. One of our centerpieces of our economic diplomacy. We talked earlier, I think it was Senator Coons had mentioned the work on fragile states and the hope of preventing fragility so that states don't collapse into some of the havens that you now see where terrorism takes a hold and so forth. And one of the things you can do to help a country become more stable and then more prosperous is access to reliable and affordable energy. And that is that's not simply for everyday life. That is critical if you want to build a manufacturing sector. It's going to be especially critical in a world in which all these new technologies like AI are going to require a tremendous amount of power generation that's going to draw upon global energy resources to begin with. So absolutely, it needs to be at the centerpiece, and we'll work very closely with the Energy Department in ensuring that it's a centerpiece of our foreign policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And next up, we have Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Marco, Senator Rubio, the president made a great decision in choosing you. I'm happy to see you there. You're a thought leader in foreign policy. I, however, don't think most Americans know how great of a thought leader you are in NCAA, NFL, and high school football. And I'm a little disappointed that you're not going to be the head of the NCAA right now.
Not yet.
We sat in my office recently. I told you about my concerns about Africa right now. Democratic Republican administrations have not prioritized the continent. It is literally the fastest growing continent on Earth. We now see the future. By 2050, 1 out of every 4 human beings on the planet will be in the continent of Africa. And because of the demographic issues we have around the globe, from Europe to the United States to even China, 1 out of every 3 working people on the planet will be in Africa. It is rich with arable land and critical minerals. It has an economic potential that could create tremendous markets for American companies and American businesses. More than this, we know, while it has incredible assets and opportunities, a lack of focus on Africa can endanger the whole planet. We know in the days of infectious diseases, for example, an outbreak of an infectious disease anywhere is a threat to public health everywhere. More than that, we see the climate challenges, migration patterns there threaten to destabilize the Middle East and other areas. Egypt, for example, literally is hosting millions of refugees in Egypt right now. Now, my frustrations in my 12 years here is that we as a nation have not really prioritized it. We do not have ambassadors in some countries where China and Russia, who understand the African opportunities, are investing heavily. I've gone around the world, and in my times in African countries, I often encounter people that saying, hey, the Chinese are here, where are you? And it's not just ambassadorial placements. Other critical positions in embassies just aren't being filled. And therefore, we're being outplayed by the Chinese and the Russians. African countries and leaders have told me time and time again, we prefer you. We'd rather deal with you. We'd rather work with you. And we can see by legal immigration patterns that their people would rather our way of life than the Chinese or the Russians. But we are simply being outplayed in ways that we can counter if we had a real focus and a real strategy for engaging Africa. And the impact of U.S. engagement is real. And the backbone of our diplomacy is that diplomat abroad, is that Secretary of State on down, people saying this is a priority. I said this to you in our office, and I want to make it plain now that we are at a point in this country that what we do in the Senate and in the White House and in the State Department are planting seeds for the future. We could reap a tremendous harvest in 10, 20 years, prioritizing and emphasizing our work in Africa. And not to do so undermines the 3 points that you said at the beginning that I agree. Our foreign policy should be guided by what makes us safe, strong, and prosperous. And the future, in so many ways, is Africa. Could you just talk to me a little bit about how you are prioritizing it, how you understand the critical opportunities and the dangers of not engaging at a higher level than either the Biden administration, Trump administration, Clinton administration, Bush administration have done?
Yeah, and I'll preface it by saying that obviously I'm not been confirmed yet. The president's not in office yet. There will be a national security strategy that will frame much of what we do in foreign policy. So what I'm going to share with you basically here today is, as someone who will be at that table, some of the impressions that I would share with regards to our historic involvement in Africa and also some of our challenges moving forward. So the first, and you've already highlighted all of the things about the growth that's going to happen. I think they'll double in population between now and 2020, 35 or what have you. So it's extraordinary. That isn't just an interesting number. that's also markets. Those are also consumers. Those are also places that I think provide an extraordinary opportunity, properly positioned, for America to become more prosperous. Literally, more people that can afford to buy the things Americans provide, both in services and goods, and vice versa. So I think there's an extraordinary opportunity. Where I think some of our situation in Africa has fallen off has been, it's been, and rightfully so, heavily focused on counterterrorism and solely on counterterrorism in some places. And that's valuable and important. It is very difficult for a country to progress or move forward if they are in fact a haven, for that's open. And so, the freaks come out at night and you've got terrorist groups that are operating and undermining that country. So it's not that it's unimportant. I think we're also learning from the Sahel how quickly the situation changes. Despite significant counterterrorism contributions, each of those countries have pivoted to their great mistake, grave error, towards the Africa Corps led by Russia. These people are not any good at fighting counterterrorism and unreliable, and I think the moment will come when they'll realize that, and maybe there will be a new opportunity to engage. On the flip side of it, if you look at littoral West Africa, there are real opportunities there for, and in fact, ongoing engagements, not just on counterterrorism, but on economic progress. I look in the north to Morocco, another place where we have already seen substantial improvements because of the accords, but also because phase 2 of that relationship that continues to build. You also talk about one thing that I don't think has been talked about enough, and I think we hear the term as a 19th century term. The impact that malaria has is not simply a health crisis or humanitarian crisis. It has deep economic crisis, deep economic implications. It pulls kids out of school for long periods of time and not end their lives. It literally sets people and communities back. Humans and people are the greatest resource of any country. And the cost benefit of an investment, leveraging private partnerships to deal with things like malaria, pays extraordinary dividends if appropriately done and channeled. And that is something that I think could, as part of an overall approach to Africa, be included in things that you could argue are improving our prosperity, our security.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. You've affirmed a lot of this to me in our private talks. I just want to make an emphasis publicly here that the disinformation in Africa, and you've mentioned disinformation writ large, but, for example, the Washington Post published an article in October detailing how Russian propagandists targeted U.S. anti-malaria programs in Burkina Faso. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies published in March 2024 highlighted how Russia and China are leading sponsors of disinformation campaigns in Africa that are showing incredible success because we aren't doing a coordinated campaign to counter their misinformation. And so I'm looking forward to working with you. I hope that you'll prioritize this for the sake of America's future, that you could be the Secretary of State that says we have a vision for Africa and we're backing it up, not just from the Secretary of State's office, but all the way down to making sure key resources are invested in countering disinformation, as well as making sure that we have personnel in there. It's not a popular post. As you know, for many State Department people, we've got to make it that way and let people know that they're helping to define the future of not just the United States, but humanity by focusing on Africa. I cannot let my time expire without talking about the biggest humanitarian crisis going on the planet Earth right now. What is happening in Sudan, it's been called by our country a genocide. There's a famine being declared in areas where you're seeing unbelievable levels of systemic sexual violence going on. I traveled to the Sudan border with Chad and saw humanitarian crises like I'd never seen before, and I've been around the world looking at humanitarian crises. We have a great special envoy who you've already positively name-checked in this confirmation hearing. It is so important and vital that work continue and that we work for diplomatic solutions. There are a lot of our allies who've been implicated in fueling this crisis. This is an opportunity to end this crisis by diplomacy, to bring about one of the most important peace processes there are. And I'm hoping that you and incoming President Trump will prioritize that.
Yeah, in an era in which the term genocide has been misappropriated to almost a global slander, an international slander, this is a real genocide. By its very definition, this is a real genocide. This is the ethnic targeting of specific groups for extermination, for elimination, by groups, by the way, that are being funded by nations that we have alliances and partnerships with in other parts of the world. And we should express that clearly. I think in part of our engagement with the UAE, and it'll have to be a pragmatic engagement. I mean, they're important players in what we hope to resolve in the Middle East. And I think as part of that engagement, we also need to raise the fact that they are openly supporting an entity that is carrying out a genocide. And I think for those who are interested in going out and actually protesting a real genocide, this to be the one, and I just don't see it. I don't see people mentioning it.
It is morally reprehensible that this crisis gets virtually no attention in our country, especially because of the role we should be playing. And my time is over, but I want to say this, no need to respond. But the other place on the planet that gets no attention, that we are responsible for in our hemisphere, is the crisis in Haiti as well.
Correct.
I know that you know this intimately. And again, I just want to keep calling out these moral omissions of our country, often, at least in the press, of an inability to focus our compassion, empathy, and understanding of our interwoven destinies with places like Africa and places like Haiti.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Booker, for that. Those are things that needed to be said. Having said that, you have underlined probably the most difficult crises we have on the planet. And I think everybody's ready to sign up on a path forward. So far, nobody's laid out that path forward. And you're right. We have an obligation to at least try to design a path forward. And when that happens, I have no doubt that we'll pull together Republicans and Democrats and as Americans to do something about this. But I'll tell you, the identifying who are the people there that are the good guys that you can partner with is very, very difficult, as you know. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Rubio, for your comments in that regard. We will move now to Senator Paul.
Senator Rubio, congratulations on your nomination. One of the questions that I've asked over time to secretaries of state as well as ambassadors and others from the State Department is, can you name for me instances where sanctions have changed behavior for the better? Now, I'm not going to ask you that question now. I'm going to wait till you come back to ask you. There's a preview of what I'll ask you the next time. But the reason I bring that up is that I think hopefully people think of sanctions as a way of trying to modulate behavior. You want better behavior out of a country. A country's doing something you don't like. You'd like them to change their behavior for better through sanctions. And I think it rarely works, and I think we pile more on. Now, some would say, well, sanctions are just to punish them, and we just want to, Russia invaded Ukraine, we're just punishing them. And so as punishment, they kind of work. I don't think they're deterring Russia's behavior or changing it. But really, sanctions can have effect in a couple of ways. I think the threat of a sanction, the same way the threat of a tariff can have an effect on behavior. But once placed, I think a sanction or a tariff only has effect on someone's behavior if you remove it. Now, you mentioned earlier a little bit about discussing ways to unwind some of the sanctions ultimately on Russia. People mentioned, well, we never want to let them sell energy again. No, you have to let people enter back into the world. That's how you're going to get behavioral changes. And it really will have to be part of the peace. If there is going to be a negotiated peace, the one aspect that makes us part of that war are all the sanctions. And so it really should be offered up of removing that and going back to normalcy when we can find a resolution to the war. I'll give you an example of where I think often the State Department loses its sight of its mission. Instead of being the Department of Diplomacy, which I think it's supposed to be, it becomes just an extension of the Department of War and muscle, and we show how strong we are through the State Department. But really, when bellicose statements come from other parts of the government, I see the State Department as the one that shows up and tries to still have a conversation. In the past, I think because of remarks, you had been banned from travel to China. The ambassador that's been nominated also has had statements that make us question whether or not he'll be received in China if he becomes the ambassador to China. When Blinken and Yellen went to China recently, they decided, and I'm not arguing with the goal was to get China not to sell dual-use parts to Russia to use in the war against Ukraine. A noble goal, I share the goal. But they got to China and they shamed them in public and called them names and told them they're terrible people and they should quit doing it. I would argue that there's another way to try to get behavioral changes. I would argue that the opposite of sanctions is trade. And so we have a lot of sanctions on China. If I'd been the one going to China with a mission, I would have said to China very quietly, we may not be able to undo everything, but perhaps we could undo one bit of sanctions that will enhance your economy by X amount if you'll agree to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia. And I think that's just it's a different look on things, and I don't think we're getting it very often. I guess my hope is that you will think about a different way of doing business other than just saying, let's sanction everybody and let's call people names we don't like, because I don't think it helps. I think it actually makes the situation worse. And that doesn't mean we curl up in a ball and just say, do whatever you want, but there has to be some give and take. There has to be something we take back. And so I guess my general question to you would be, we know a lot about the stick, we know about sanctions and this and that. Do you see any possibility of any carrot with China to make relations better with China?
Well, let me first say, indeed, I've been strongly worded in my views of China. Let me just point out, they've said mean things about me, too. And I'm not sure that they're fans of mine in that regard here. My role now as the Secretary of State is to lead the diplomatic wing of the country, and that will involve engaging them. The fact of the matter is, in a mature and prudent conversation, and I would expect that they, at the end of the day, are also mature and prudent practitioners of foreign policy. They've got 1 billion people and nuclear weapons and a large economy. We have 400 million people, the largest economy in the world in nuclear weapons, and it is in their interest, our interest, and the interest of the world for two great powers to be able to communicate. In fact, despite everything I have said, I have consistently throughout my career said that it is that geopolitical balance between our countries, or imbalance, developing imbalance, that is the greatest risk to global security and prosperity, because that could quickly trigger not just a trade and economic conflict, but an armed one, which could be catastrophic. Never in the history of mankind have two powers like the United States and China ever faced off in a global conflict, and the outcome would be catastrophic, and we should want to avoid it, and so should they. So the bottom line is this: yes, we are going to have to deal with China. They're too big and too important in the world, and they're going to have to deal with us. And my goal is that it is dealt with in a way that furthers our national interest. What cannot continue to happen is that China continues to assume all of the benefits of the international system and none of its obligations, all the benefits of global trade and commerce and none of its obligations. Your point on sanctions are important. I think that one of the things that's happened over time is we have adopted this view that we're going to be involved in less armed conflicts, which I think is a positive, generally speaking, right? Most would agree. The only other alternative left in the toolbox then is economic sanctions. And while I do think that you can question whether it has an impact over changing the behavior of a country, it can achieve two things. The first is it can deny a nation state the resources they could use to fund more of that activity. Let there be no doubt. If the Iranian regime had more money because of no sanctions, they would have spent more money on Hezbollah and Hamas and their missile program and the Houthis and others. So I do think there is value in that regard. And the second is, to be frank, leverage. When you sit down at a table, let's say we talk about Ukraine and the need to end that conflict, when you get and sit at the table, and the United States is involved in those conversations, hopefully, to reach a peaceful settlement of that conflict, you're going to have to give, not just get. And sanctions and the release of sanctions could be a part of that, assuming that the conditions are appropriate. So I do think sanctions also have a role to play in that regard. But I would not diminish the part about denying resources for governments and countries to carry out nefarious denying them the ability to have the resources to carry out these nefarious activities.
I think you're right, and the point is probably valid with regard to Iran. Probably not so much with China. I don't think we've denied China resources, and I think their resources extend beyond what we can do. I think our sanctions are more, prodding them, but not really damaging their economic prospects. With regard to the concept of diplomacy and how we make things better, or attempt to make things better, I think if we have absolutes, we tend to not understand really the way diplomacy has to work, because it is about engagement, it's about hearing the other side. It's not about accepting their position, but it's about at least knowing what the position of the other side is. With regard to NATO and Ukraine, to a person, the State Department under the previous administration is adamant, and so are many Republicans, that there is absolutely no way we will ever say that Ukraine could be a neutral country. That absolutely they will be, and it is our absolute prerogative to invite anybody we want to into NATO. Well, we can say that, and we have the ability to do that, but there are consequences to that, and one of the consequences is that, at least from the Russian perspective, they see that as one of the reasons why the war has developed there. And so I think that if you are looking at peace, you have to look at first you have to get to a ceasefire before you even get to real discussions. But if you had a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, I think our sanctions need to be on the table as far as negotiating the removal of them. But I think also the idea of Ukraine being a neutral country as far as a military alliance, if it's not on the table, Ukraine doesn't have that much to offer. I mean, Russia now occupies a good 15, 20% of the country. It's been a big bloody war, and they've done it in a sort of World War I fashion, but I don't think they're going anywhere. It is at a stalemate. But the one thing Ukraine has to offer is they won't become part of a military alliance allied against Russia. Just not taking it off the table enhances our ability to negotiate and enhances Ukraine's ability. I think Zelensky's public words have been a little less firm than they had been in the past. But instead, I think we've done the opposite with our diplomacy. Every day, it's Blinken, beating the drums. They absolutely be in Ukraine. Do you think that the concept of a neutral Ukraine, not in NATO, can be part of the negotiations to end the war?
Well, obviously, that's something that will ultimately be part of any negotiation. I do agree with your point that if we want to be real here for a second, because I think we've lost the art of reality in some of the foreign policy. These are not outcomes that are rarely are they ideal. Sadly, in many cases, our choices in foreign policy are a choice between a bad outcome and an even worse outcome. And that's been true not in the modern era, but throughout the history of diplomacy and nation-state relations. In the case of conflicts such as these, they invariably require concessions. I don't think it would be wise nor appropriate before we're even in office or even in any public forum such as this to discuss the parameters of what those potential concessions can be for either side. Suffice it to say, I do think, to be honest with the committee and the full Senate, if you want to reach agreements to end armed conflict where people are dying on a daily basis and enormous destruction is occurring and a great potential for escalation exists on a daily basis, if we want to be honest about bringing that to an end, true diplomacy will require concessions from every party engaged in those conversations. That's the nature of diplomacy, and it's best conducted directly and in an appropriate forum and not in public. And that can be done, by the way, without abandoning our core principles as a nation or our feelings as a people about what's happened and transpired in that conflict to date.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen. Senator Rubio, good to see you. It was great to sit down with you and talk about some of these important issues yesterday. Let me just say at the outset that I appreciate your response to Senator Booker's question about what's happening in Sudan, specifically as the Biden administration just found that the RSF under Hamedi is engaged in a genocide, and we need to do everything we can to stop what's happening there. You referred obliquely to some of our sort of Gulf partners who have not done what they should be doing. One of them is the UAE, and I've been very clear that the United States should not be providing military assistance to the UAE when the UAE is in turn providing military assistance to a group like the RSF that is committing a genocide in Sudan. And I'm expecting a briefing from the Biden administration by the end of this week as to whether or not their commitments to President Biden to stop doing that have been fulfilled. I want to pick up on a couple of the issues we discussed yesterday. One, as you know, Senator Sullivan and I are the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Foreign Service Caucus. We've passed a number of pieces of legislation through the United States Congress, most recently the Foreign Service Families Act. As you know, and we discussed yesterday, you know the importance of supporting the men and women at the State Department, including the Foreign Service, and I appreciate your willingness to work with us in the caucus to continue to make sure that they have what they need to do their jobs effectively. We also discussed the ongoing war in Ukraine and the importance of supporting the Ukrainian people. against Putin's aggression, and I just want to say for the record, I support and endorse everything that Senator Shaheen said on that score, so I don't have to go into great detail. I will say that we know that what happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. And it's not just me saying that. That is what we've heard repeatedly from leaders in Japan, leaders in South Korea, and other partners of ours in the Indo-Pacific region. So I hope that we will continue to focus on that, because what we do know is that President Xi has one eye on what's happening in Ukraine and another eye on what's happening in Taiwan, and measuring everybody's response. Like you, and we've worked on a bipartisan basis to try to make sure that we meet the challenge of China. Lots of important pieces of legislation that have passed, but none yet to really rise to meeting those challenges. I do support the Biden administration's ongoing efforts to restrict the flow of very high-end technologies, the highest-end chips, to China that can be used in their military. We're going to have to work successfully with our allies to do that, just like the Trump administration back in the day worked on the Huawei issue. So my view is that we need to expand that effort. We also discussed the volatile situation in the Middle East. You know, we often talk about the importance of shifting our focus to China and the Indo-Pacific, but we always seem to get dragged back into conflicts in the Middle East. I want to start with Syria. Good riddance to the murderous Assad regime. Obviously, we have a stake in what comes next in Syria, given the fact that it's a very volatile part of the world. I support the very cautious engagement of the Biden administration with HTS, but we should acknowledge their very poisonous genealogy, beginning with al-Qaeda morphing into al-Nusra. The other issue, of course, in Syria is that when you've got a situation like we see today, there are opportunities for ISIS to get further back on its feet, to provide it more oxygen. And as you know, the tip of the spear in our fight against ISIS has been our Syrian Kurdish partners, the SDF. But at this moment, President Erdogan of Turkey has been backing attacks of the so-called Syrian National Army, which Turkey largely controls, against our partners, the Syrian Kurds, which opens the door to a revival of ISIS. Because of the actions of the United States government, Turkey has so far paused that effort. Senator Graham and I have introduced legislation to impose sanctions on Turkey should they renew those attacks in an aggressive way. We talked about this. I know that you recognize the importance of that partnership with the Syrian Kurds, but just a very straightforward question. Do you agree that we should continue to support our partners, the SDF, in the fight against ISIS?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Not only that, but I think we also need to recognize that there are implications to abandoning partners who have a great sacrifice and threat, actually jailed the ISIS fighters. One of the reasons why we were able to dismantle ISIS is because they were willing to host them in jails, a great personal threat to them. And obviously that situation is very tenuous. I don't want to take up a lot of your time, but I do think it's important to respond to this opportunity in Syria, because it could be an opportunity. Look, the new people that are in charge there are not going to pass an FBI background check, okay? We recognize that. These are not people we know all about, and their history, as you said, is not one that gives us comfort. That said, it is in the national interest of the United States, if possible, to have a Syria that's no longer a playground for ISIS, that respects religious minorities, ranging from Alawis all the way to Christians, that protects the Kurds, and at the same time is not a vehicle through which Iran can spread its terrorism to Hezbollah and destabilize Lebanon, not to mention what's happened in other parts. Not only is it in the national interest of the United States, it's in the national interest of virtually every nation state in the Middle East to see that come about. That is worth exploring. There is an interesting dynamic at play, and Senator Paul asked a moment ago about the impact of sanctions. I would argue that the Caesar sanctions directly contributed to the downfall of the Assad regime in many ways. we find ourselves in this interesting situation now where, because I think it was reauthorized as part of NDAA, we now have these sanctions in place against the government that no longer exists. But nonetheless, it's an opportunity for us to explore how we could use that tool, the removal of it, and others, if in fact the territory is fertile for these outcomes. There are impediments to this that go beyond simply the new people in charge. And one of them, as you pointed out, is Erdogan and what his intentions are. Right now, there's a very tenuous ceasefire with regards to the Kurds. It's important for that to be maintained. I think it's important to signal to Erdogan early, including through this hearing, that they should not view a transition in power in the U.S. as a window in which they could take advantage of to sort of violate whatever agreements are in place. Right now, what we want in Syria is stability so that we can explore what opportunities exist to bring a different dynamic, because it would have an impact on Lebanon, on Israel, on the situation in Gaza, and on the broader Middle East. And to walk away from an opportunity that may not come back. By the way, the Russians have been run out of there, the Iranians have been run out of there, but they are pragmatic foreign policy operators. If we don't explore these opportunities, they will work their way back in there at some point.
And I agree with everything you just said, and look forward to working with you on that. Let me turn to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we also discussed yesterday. And we all witnessed the horrific October 7th Hamas terror attacks on Israel. We've also witnessed the devastation and human rights catastrophe in Gaza. Like you, I've met Israeli families who lost loved ones on October 7th. I've met with hostage families. I've also met with Palestinian families who lost kids and other innocents in this war. So I was very pleased to see the announcement today of the ceasefire and the return of hostages. Let us pray that it holds and that it is implemented. But of course, as we discussed yesterday, the question is what happens next. And we all agree that Hamas can have no role in the governance of Gaza or any other place. We also know that for all its flaws and faults, the Palestinian Authority has recognized Israel's right to exist for the last 30 years since the Oslo Accords. Their security forces are trained by U.S. forces. They today are fighting Palestinian militants in certain parts of the West Bank. But at the same time, their funds have been restricted by the Netanyahu government today. These are the funds that belong to the PA. We've seen a record increase in the number of settlements in the West Bank. And so the PA is not able to deliver on what had been the hope of Oslo, which is self-determination, security, and dignity for both Israelis and Palestinians. So you have said that the ideal way forward, recognizing that we've been at this for a long time, is a two-state solution. There are members of the Netanyahu government that today want to annex all of the West Bank. So my question is, do you agree that annexation would be contrary to peace and security in the Middle East? And what is your vision going forward?
First, let me say that, yeah, the ideal would be that there not be conflict and the people could live side by side with one another without being in conflict and the ability to pursue prosperity. Sadly and unfortunately, the conditions for that to exist have not been in place for some substantial period of time. I point to you as an example, back in 2020, the Trump administration offered $58 billion, or about $50 billion or $58 billion, $58 to $50 billion in investment to the Palestinians. And that included, I believe, 28 or 29 billion specifically for Gaza, and it was rejected. That offer was made back in January of 2020, and then it pivoted over as a result of that rejection to what we now know as the Abraham Accords. Second, I would say that Israel is a small nation who at its narrowest point is 9 miles wide. It has been historically surrounded by enemies that seek their destruction. Hezbollah to the north, Hamas to the west, Iran further north with nuclear weapons, constantly. In fact, I would argue that if Israel had not been firm and strong in its response in this endeavor, most recently, they may very well have faced an existential threat, as they continue to in many ways. Now, here's the good news, and it's not just about the ceasefire today, although that's very important. The good news is that potentially we have had a dynamic shift in the region that has an historic opportunity, if appropriately structured and pursued, that changes the dynamics of what might be possible. And that, we've discussed Syria, we've discussed the events in Lebanon quite a bit as well, the degrading of the Iranian capability, which I hope will continue, and hopefully the ability to reach some agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia on normalization and being able to engage both for their mutual security and also economic prosperity. The real open question for the Palestinians is, who will govern Who will govern in Gaza in the short term and who will ultimately govern? Will it be the Palestinian Authority or some other entity? Because it has to be someone. That was the initial goal for Gaza when the Israelis withdrew from there, and they turned it over. And they turned it over with greenhouses, and they turned it over with all kinds of economic development. Hamas won an election. They took over, and they destroyed the place and built tunnels for terrorists to operate from. So the key is not simply governance. It's who will govern. You can't turn it over to people who seek your destruction. And so I do think this is a very complex issue, and I think that's understating it. We all recognize it. But I also believe that we should not underestimate the potential opportunities that now exist. And it'll take some time to fully understand what those are, that perhaps open the door to things that were not open in the future. But from the Israeli perspective, which I fully understand, it begins with their existence. Because you cannot coexist with armed elements at your border who seek your destruction and evisceration as a state. You just can't. No nation on it. We wouldn't tolerate it, and they can't either. And it begins with having that level of security, and if they do, then I think there are opportunities that come about as a result of it. Those opportunities historically have not existed in recent times. Perhaps we're living in an era where that will be, the likelihood of it is higher because of recent events, unexpected events in Syria and Lebanon and other places.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. So I was in Miami, or Hialeah on Monday, and when there's a video where you were recognizing Alina Garcia and Dario Fernandez and Tomas Regalado, everybody applauded. They're so excited about your being the Secretary of State. Your homegrown son, and so they're just all excited. The other thing they're excited about is that they have somebody that is going to care about Venezuela and Cuba and Haiti and Nicaragua, all the problems, because you've been so vocal. So I guess, can you just go through sort of one by one and say, look, we know what are our options? Not that you know exactly what you're going to do, and a lot of these decisions will be made by somebody else anyway, but what are, like right now, look at what's going on in Venezuela. The Biden administration's allowed oil to flow. He stole the election, completely violated what Biden told him he would do. Maria Corina Machado probably was only alive because of your hard work making sure that Donald Trump put a tweet out. You look at Cuba now. They just dropped the state-sponsored terrorism, which makes no sense. We've got people like Jose Daniel Ferrer in prison. Kids as young as 14 in prison for peaceful protests. So give me some of your ideas of what is possible.
Let's take one, but let's start with Haiti, because in many ways it's globally complex, and I think the chairman sort of alluded to this a moment ago. There's a fundamental problem in Haiti in that there is no legitimacy of authority. And I say this in recognition of the fact that some of the national police forces in Haiti have been extraordinarily brave. Despite being outgunned and outmanned, these guys and gals have stuck at their post and fought back against armed gangs. You know, when the most powerful person in any nation state is nicknamed barbecue, that is not a good thing. And this guy obviously is not named that for good reasons. He's not a cook. These are bad gang elements that are operating within Haiti and have destabilized not just Haiti, but threatened to destabilize the Dominican Republic, not to mention the migratory pressure that it places on the United States, on the Bahamas, and on other places in the region. There is no easy answer. The Kenyans are there, and I tell you, I think they deserve a lot of credit for being willing to take on that mission. In recent days, missions from various other countries have arrived, El Salvador being among them, to sort of contribute to that effort. I don't think anyone can tell you they have a master plan for how you fix that overnight. I do think it does begin with stability and security. You've got to establish some baseline security, and it's not going to come from a U.S. military intervention. So to the extent that we can encourage foreign partners, and I would include foreign partners in the Western Hemisphere, who should be contributing to this effort, to provide some level of stability and security in Haiti so that you can explore the opportunities to have a transitional government that has legitimacy, that can ultimately lead to the conduct of elections, and then have governing bodies in that country that can bring about a nation state that can begin to build some of the things you need in order for permanency. But it's going to take a long time. And I say this with sadness in my heart. There have been good times and there have been bad times and worse times in Haiti, but sadly there's not really been a golden era in Haiti's history, and your heart breaks for these people and for what they've gone through. But you also, as a policymaker in the United States, recognize the implications it's had on our country, it's not just in the migratory pressures it's placed on us, but as I pointed out earlier, the threat it poses on a daily basis to destabilizing the Dominican Republic. You mentioned Nicaragua. It's a very weird situation, for lack of a better term. The Sandinistas earlier, one of the first things they did in the new year is they kicked out every nun in the country. They've gone to war with the Catholic Church, which was the last institution in the country capable of standing up to them. But now they've begun this process of amending their fake constitution to basically create a family dynasty, so that Ortega and his wife will now be co-presidents. There's no democracy that's been completely wiped out. They have literally put plane loads of opposition figures and exported them here to the United States and around the world. They literally arrested anyone who signed up to run for president. They arrested every single, you signed up to run for president, they put you in jail. So it's a big challenge, but our national interest is most challenged. Number one, because of migratory pressure. Number two, because the Nicaraguan regime is allowing people to fly into Nicaragua visa-free from anywhere in the world and then transit to the United States. They have become the point of entry for people from all over the world because you come in without any visa, they charge you $1,000 or whatever the going rate is today, and from there you get on the migratory route and into the United States. They have been direct contributors to the migratory crisis we face at our southern border. And the third is the Nicaraguans have basically invited the Russians to establish a military naval presence in Nicaragua, in our hemisphere. That poses a threat to our national security. That needs to be addressed. Venezuela, sadly, is not governed by government. It's governed by a narco-trafficking organization that has empowered itself of a nation state. And we have seen, I believe, upwards of 7, 8, 9 million Venezuelans have just left the country. More are expected to leave. I was in strong disagreement with the Biden administration because they got played the way that I knew they would get played. They entered into negotiations with Maduro. He agreed to have elections. The elections were completely fake. They leveraged migration against us to get those concessions, and now they have these general licenses where companies like Chevron are actually providing billions of dollars of money into the regime's coffers, and the regime kept none of the promises that they made. So all that needs to be re-explored. Because in Venezuela, you have the Russian presence, you have a very strong Iranian presence. The Iranians, in fact, are exploring, or in fact are beginning to build drone factories for the manufacture of Iranian drones in our own hemisphere. Not to mention the long practice of the Venezuelan regime of providing real but illegitimate passports to operatives for Hezbollah in our own hemisphere. And lastly, and I leave it lastly to Cuba because it's one that's been more enduring, the problem in Cuba basically is that despite being a communist regime and Marxism not working, is that they've decided, and they thought what they would do is that they would create this holding company. It's called Gaesa. It is a company that they own by the Cuban military, and that holding company owns everything that makes money in Cuba. If it makes money in Cuba, they own it, and it generates revenue for them. The Miami Herald just did an expose on Gaesa. And while you have electrical blackouts and you have all these other problems economically in Cuba, Gaesa is sitting on billions of dollars that they've generated for their permanency. In 2017, the Trump administration sanctioned Gaesa. Unfortunately, the Biden administration lifted some of those sanctions and restrictions a couple of years ago, which increased the amount of money they're able to generate through things like manipulating remittances and the like. And then yesterday, the Biden administration announced they were rescinding all of the sanctions on Gaesa, which basically the sanctions were this. You can do business with an independent individual Cuban, but you cannot, it's the regime that doesn't allow it. You cannot do business with anything owned by that government-run entity. And yesterday they lifted the sanctions on them. Now, the new administration is not bound by that decision, but nonetheless that's what's in place. Ultimately, the reality, the moment of truth is arriving. Cuba is literally collapsing, both generationally in terms of all the young people leaving, but it's also collapsing economically. They are now living on 20 and 21-hour rolling blackouts and some days longer because Marxism doesn't work, because they're corrupt, and because they're inept. And they're going to have a choice to make, those that are in charge there. Do they open up to the world? Do they allow the individual Cuban to have control over their economic and political destiny, even though it threatens the security and stability of the regime? Or do they triple down and just say, we'd rather be the owners and controllers of a fourth world country that's falling apart and has lost 10% of its population in the last 2 years. And that's a dynamic that they're facing right now. I hope that they will choose the path of empowering the individual Cuban so that the individual Cuban has the ability to do what the peoples of virtually every other country in the hemisphere have been able to do at least once in the last 60 years, and some more than once, and that is elect their leaders, vote for their leaders. You think about what happened here today. The Cuban people have no idea what it's like to have an authority figure or someone in charge and power, like I am as a U.S. Senator, sitting here having to answer questions from his colleagues, and also having to have people in the back screaming and protesting against you. You can't do that to a Cuban official. You can't question their decisions. The Cuban people have never been able to participate in a political process for almost 70 years now. And they're entitled to that as much as the people of Colombia and Argentina and Paraguay and Peru and virtually every other country in the region has enjoyed.
So let's assume you have this job, you're confirmed, you have the job for 4 years. What would your definition of success be?
With regards to generally?
Your job. You're just...
The alignment of our foreign policy to our national interest has been defined, the security, prosperity of the American people. And that's, and by the way, I would define that as success for the country. What I would define as success for the State Department is not just that alignment, but making the State Department highly relevant again. Sadly, and I think I've shared this with you in some of our meetings with many of my colleagues, what has happened over the last 20 years under multiple administrations is the influence of the State Department has declined at the expense of other agencies and also at the expense of national security councils because it takes so long for the State Department to take action. And so increasingly you stop getting invited to the meetings and they stop putting you in charge of things because it takes too long to get a result. So we want the State Department to be relevant again, and it should be, because the State Department has a plethora of talented people who are subject matter experts and who have skills in diplomacy, and it's not being fully utilized because increasingly on issue after issue we've seen the State Department marginalized because of internal inertia, because of the way the structure works. So we have to be able to we have to be at that table when decisions are being made, and the State Department has to be a source of creative ideas and effective implementation. So I would define making the State Department relevant again in the setting of our foreign policy is critical. And I think that's something that maybe is not as perceived by the general public as it is by those of us who watch it on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, for holding this hearing and for welcoming me to the committee. You know, I'm joining this committee at a challenging time for the global community, from conflicts with Iranian proxies in the Middle East to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, growing tensions with China, a genocide in Sudan, and so much more. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to find bipartisan solutions to these problems. And I also want to thank you, Senator Rubio, your family that's here, and those that couldn't be here, for working with me over the last 6 years and your service to our nation. And I'd like to congratulate you again on your nomination. And I'm going to move on. I just want to make a quick statement because ensuring the United States remains a steadfast supporter of Israel, I know, is one of your top priorities and one of mine. And throughout your time in the Senate, you've been one of Israel's most unwavering supporters. I want to thank you for supporting Israel. I look forward to working with you to ensure that the U.S.-Israel security partnership remains ironclad and that our friendship remains unconditional. And I want to thank you for your response to Senator McCormick's hostage question. We all hope, since we've been in this hearing, that there's news maybe of an imminent agreement being reached to free, I hope, all the hostages. We hope to hear that confirmation soon. But nevertheless, these issues must remain a top priority for the committee going forward. So I'm going to just move over to talking about Abraham Accord, speaking of going forward, because despite the immense challenges that you've addressed posed by October 7th, the Abraham Accords have ushered in new forms of cooperation between Israel and countries in the Middle East and North Africa. As one of the founders and co-chairs of the bipartisan Senate Abraham Accords Caucus, I firmly believe the U.S. should continue building on the accords by deepening people-to-people ties, soft diplomacy, if you will, and widening the circle of partnerships with Israel to new countries. So, Senator Rubio, I know you've touched on this briefly, but if confirmed, how will you support the growth of the Abraham Accords to new countries generally, and specifically maybe try to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
Thank you. I think those are important points. A couple things that have come up here as a result of this. The first is, and I point this again because we just don't know, it's a new development, but I think we should not underestimate or understate the potential historic opportunities that exist right now with what's happened very unexpectedly for most in Syria, what's happened in Lebanon, the weakening of Iran and of its Shia crescent of destabilization in the region. These are extraordinary opportunities that I think lend themselves to an era of diminishing insecurity, not total the elimination of it, but enough security that it opens the door for agreement on other topics. Critical to that is the potential of a Saudi normalization with Israel. And I think that, as part of a broader context of the Abraham Accords, I think would be historic in nature, and I think provide extraordinary benefits to the world and help bring a level of stability and peace to an area that, frankly, has not had it, one could say, for thousands of years, but certainly in my lifetime. You talk about what we could do to build on it. I think the most important part of any arrangement of countries that enter into these agreements that historically have been difficult is there has to be a benefit to it. They have to perceive that there's a benefit to it, particularly among themselves. Like, what is the benefit to a country? What benefits will Saudi Arabia derive from being in recognition of Israel and vice versa? And I could think of a variety of things, whether it's advances in what their investments in high tech and how Saudi Arabia wants to diversify its own economy, the ability of cross investments, and also, frankly, of security. Because for the foreseeable future, I think most anticipate that there will be a mutual threat from Tehran. It may not be openly stated as a military alliance, but it's certainly a security, certainly one that I think they both have a mutual interest in, and which I think the U.S. could be a very strong partner in providing those assurances as well. So I do think there's a real opportunity to expand it, and it won't be without irritants. There's no doubt about it. There won't be without irritants. That we're still going to have some issues with UAE or Saudi Arabia, but we also have to be pragmatic enough to understand what an enormous achievement it would be if, in fact, not just you get a ceasefire, but you actually, that leads to the opening, the opportunity of a Saudi-Israeli partnership and joint recognition. What that would mean to the region is historic.
And you've talked about potential opportunities going forward, and we talk about maybe not just with other countries, but how does the private sector get involved in creating building and sustaining the normalization in areas of water insecurity, power insecurity, healthcare, technology. We know that there are ways that we can do this. They have been doing it. How does the private sector feed into this?
I think from an economic and development perspective, they're the linchpin of it. I think one of the things that could come about as a result of an agreement between the Saudis and the Israelis is that companies and institutions in both countries would now be open and able to invest in and or partner in the economies of each other. So the Israelis, as an example, have made extraordinary advances in agricultural production. Because of geographic constraints. They've had to be incredibly creative and nonetheless have been able to, and I think the Saudis would benefit from that greatly. Likewise, I think that we know, as a startup nation, that the technological capabilities and advances that the private sector has made in Israel, and that I think would be a great interest to the Saudis in partnership. In reverse is, I think, some of the energy resources that Saudi Arabia could provide, some of the financing for projects that they work together on. The linchpin of all of these is private sector engagement. But without the governmental imprimatur, or without the government creating the pathways for that to be possible, because of recognition, because of diplomatic relations, that's what opens, that because those don't exist, that hasn't been able to happen. This would open the door for that, and I think be transformative.
Thank you. I want to continue a little bit on this theme because, of course, a lot of this also has a nexus with combating anti-Semitism, and, of course, anti-Semitism domestically and abroad. I probably founded the first ever Senate bipartisan task force to combating anti-Semitism. You and I have done a lot of work there. You're a member of the task force, and we work closely with the Special Envoy's office at the State Department. We know that global rates of anti-Semitism, they are skyrocketing. It's critical the White House ensures the special envoy in their office is sufficiently staffed, supported, and resourced. So I know we've talked about this in our meeting, and of course, like I said, we worked on this before. Can I have your commitment that you'll work with the White House to do two things? Quickly nominate a qualified candidate to be special envoy. Quickly and qualified. We really need to get somebody on board.
Yes, and I think it needs to be someone that, as we've discussed, also enjoys broad support across different sectors. But the key ultimately is, there was I don't know if it was a study or a survey or something that came out yesterday, but it showed something that's really disturbing. I think it said 60% of people on Earth hold anti-Semitic views, according to this poll, or in 60% of the countries, but I think it's at 60%. Look, unfortunately, bigotry and hatred has been a part of human nature from the very beginning, but anti-Semitism is a unique danger. The suffering that it inflicted on the world historically, but in the last century, is unimaginable and can never be allowed to be repeated. And it's something that we should make sure we're constantly speaking out against and identifying for what it is. I think the U.S.'s role as a leader in speaking out in that regard is indispensable. And we need to be forceful about it one of the things that's most troubling is what seemed to me that one of the things that's undermining the legitimacy of many of our international organisms is they've become havens for anti-Semitic activity. That oftentimes is disguised as anti-Israel, but I believe is frankly anti-Semitic. And of course, we've seen incidents of that in the United States as well. We cannot ignore what anti-Semitism has cost humanity in the past, because if that lesson is forgotten, it will very quickly repeat itself potentially in every region on the planet.
Thank you. I want to just quickly, a yes or no. We know you've talked a lot about how important deputies are in mission sets of different things. We know that if we don't have a deputy envoy in place, they keep the wheels turning. They keep the organization going waiting for the special envoy to be confirmed. Do I have your commitment that we'll quickly put in a deputy envoy to make sure that the work can continue until?
Yeah, we'll work to do that as soon as possible.
Thank you. I wanted to, I only have 56 minutes. I do not have 56 minutes. I have 56 seconds. That would be a little crazy. I know that the first Trump administration created the Women's Global Development Prosperity Initiative. It was the first whole-of-government initiative to promote women's economic empowerment, dedicated global resourcing for these activities. As Secretary, will you commit to continuing to expand on the WGDP initiative, and if so, in what ways?
Yeah, and that was a high priority of Ivanka Trump, who's no longer going to be in government, but was at the time, and she worked on that very much. And I was a supporter of it then, and look forward to being a supporter of it now, if confirmed.
Thank you. And we got that 56 minutes went awfully fast. There you go. I yield back, Mr.
Time
Chairman.
flies.
You yield back all 8 seconds?
Yes.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can barely see you down there.
I know. I was there one time.
They had to extend the dais so Senator Curtis and I could actually sit at the big boys and girls table. So, Senator Rubio, it's great to see you. I have complete confidence in your ability to lead the State Department. I think it's an inspired choice, and you couldn't be better prepared for that job. I do want to ask you a few questions, some of which I know Senator Cruz is here as well. He and I share a concern about Mexico. You've heard some concerns, particularly about the cartel activity, but I want to talk to you about water. In 1944, there was a water treaty between the United States and Mexico, and we have had chronic problems getting Mexico to cooperate and release the water that's been absolutely critical to the life and the livelihood of our agriculture community in the Rio Grande Valley and elsewhere. We've had I've talked to Secretary Blinken about this. We've written letters. We've done everything we know how to do, but I would just like to get your commitment to work with us to try to just simply get Mexico to live up to its requirements under the treaty, and if they won't do it voluntarily, to look for leverage and ways we can persuade them to do what they already have a legal obligation to do, which is to release water on a timely basis.
Absolutely, and I think one of the reasons why we need to do that is twofold. The first is because it has real implications, not just for the state of Texas, but broadly for the United States. But the second is because I think this has become part of a pattern, and I would argue part of a pattern in a number of international arrangements, but in particular international arrangements with Mexico, in which you can strike any deal you want or sign any document you want, but if you're not willing to prioritize its enforcement, you are encouraging others to get away with the same thing, and at the same time, you're undermining the willingness of people to commit to enter into agreements in the future. And this has become we've seen it with USMCA, frankly. We've seen it with a variety of other commitments that have been made by partners in other parts of the world, and we're seeing it with this treaty. Where there is a treaty, they have obligations under it, and they don't seek to meet it. And it's part of the broader challenge that I alluded to in my opening statement, which is we've entered this era where we've entered into all these international arrangements, but oftentimes they've been weaponized against us, either through noncompliance or through a creative reinterpretation. And that extends to trade all the way down to treaties such as this.
Speaking of Mexico, I know that in different quarters we've had people suggest that the cartels be identified as a foreign terrorist organization. And as I've looked into that, it feels like the right thing to do because, of course, the cartels are wreaking havoc and misery and death and destruction, not only here in the United States, but also in Mexico. But I worry a little bit about some of the unintended consequences. For example, does that create some new category of asylum, perhaps, for people who claim that they are victims of cartel activity that otherwise wouldn't exist? What's your view about the designation?
Well, and I think this question was asked earlier, so I'll tell you what I said. The first is that they most certainly are terroristic in their nature. They terrorize Mexicans, they terrorize on the U.S. side. They are involved in the trafficking of women and children, of labor, and both labor and sex trafficking, deadly fentanyl, and drugs writ large, as you can imagine. And I think, pose a grave danger in the process of trafficking people, trafficking terrorists into the United States. So they are terroristic in nature. What I said was that whether it's that designation or some new designation that we create, it is important that they be identified for what they are. I also pointed to something you just alluded to in your question, and that is they pose a grave risk to Mexican sovereignty as well. We have seen multiple journalists and politicians and candidates assassinated, murdered in Mexico by cartels because either they're not the cartel's chosen candidate or there are journalists that spoken out against the cartels and you find yourself murdered. And I don't think we should underestimate, and I hope the Mexicans do not, the amount of leverage that they have created over the Mexican government. And in some parts of Mexico, they are, in fact, have operational control of territories, particularly near the U.S.-Mexican border. So this is something that I hope we can work with jointly and cooperatively with the Mexicans to address, because it's in their interest as well as ours. Ultimately, I do not think I speak out of turn when I say that you can expect President Trump will do whatever it takes to secure the United States of America and the American people from the threat that they pose. But it is my sincerest hope, and frankly, I think the most productive outcome would be if we could do so in partnership and cooperation with the government of Mexico, who I know shares many of our concerns.
Well, that certainly should be our first choice, but I have the same confidence you have that President Trump will send a very clear message and follow that up with decisive action to persuade Mexico to do what it is in its best interest, and because it's an intolerable situation right on our southern border. We can't get a divorce. We got to make the marriage work somehow, and but it's a troubled marriage, shall I to continue the analogy. Let me talk to you briefly about the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is within the jurisdiction of this committee. This is something I've been concerned about for some time, because we have lobbyists that work here in Washington, D.C. that actually represent foreign nations that, unbeknownst to members of Congress, they're actually advocating not on behalf of the American people and American interests, but on behalf of the interests of foreign nations. Now, there is a loophole called the Lobbyist Disclosure Act, which is frankly weak sauce when it comes to providing the kind of transparency that we need. Anytime somebody shows up in your office and is advocating for something, purporting to represent American interests, but in fact is there motivated by and being paid by a foreign interest to advocate their interest, is that something that you would be willing to work with us to further reform and refine?
Yes, and as you know from our time serving together on the Intelligence Committee as well, it's something we spend a lot of time talking and thinking about as well. And I would raise 3 points. The first is, look, the straight-up some foreign government hires a lobbyist. You know that because they're registered and we're aware of it. The second is more nefarious, and that is that you hire someone through a cutout, a third party, without aware of the fact that they are in fact being paid by a foreign entity, and sometimes dressed up as an American interest, when in fact it's furthering the interest of a foreign entity. And then the third, and it's one that I don't think gets talked about enough and it isn't covered by this law, but needs to be said, is some of the most effective and vociferous lobbyists on behalf of Chinese interests in the United States for a long time was U.S. corporations, who had a pretty good deal going in China with regards to manufacturing and the like, and would come here and argue in favor of outcomes and policies that favored China. And by the way, China would weaponize this openly. They would, in fact, bring in CEOs of corporate America and encourage them to go back and talk to your member of Congress and tell them they better not do that, because if they do, companies like yours are not going to do very well in China. And that was weaponized against us, too. That's not illegal, but it's most certainly troubling and something we need to have our eyes open to as well as we move forward.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my last question, and this has to do with outbound investment transparency. As you know, the Senate has passed legislation providing for a reporting requirement for American companies who are investing in China. It's not a prohibition. It's merely a disclosure requirement because the unique circumstances that you're well aware of that China provides. There is no division between civilians or the private sector and government. Under Chinese law, the private sector, so-called private sector, is required to share any and all information that might be of use to the People's Liberation Army or to the Chinese intelligence agencies. And it is not a stretch to say that due to the tactics of people like, or strategies really, of people like Deng Xiaoping, who said, hide your motives and bide your time, we've seen massive U.S. investment in China, which has not only helped them rebuild their economy, which is fine, but more ominously rearm their military, modernize their military so that they become a threat not only to their neighbors in the region, but to world peace. We can all imagine a nightmare in which China decides to take Taiwan, which President Xi said he's committed to do. So I think it just makes sense for us to have more transparency so that as policymakers, we can then figure out what is the right policy. I could care less whether American companies want to build more Burger Kings or Starbucks in China, but I do care if American companies are investing in dual-purpose technology or in ways that would undermine the national security of the United States. Do you share that concern?
Absolutely, and in fact, I shared it beyond just simply what you've discussed. This was a few years ago when the Thrift Savings Plan, the retirement, 401k basically for federal workers, was investing in funds that are going directly to Chinese military use. So you think about it, there were people serving in the armed forces of the United States whose retirement funds were being invested in companies that were building the weapons designed to one day blow the ship that they served on, even the Indo-Pacific. And in the case of other private sectors, you're right, every sector is not created equal in terms of the threat they pose to our country. But at a minimum, we should have insight into whether American investment dollars, be they institutional or individual, are going through the funding of activities designed to undermine the United States of America. That's a core national security interest.
Thank you, and Godspeed.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Shaheen, welcome the opportunity to work with you in this Congress. Senator Rubio, congratulations on your nomination. If you're watching the hearing, you probably notice senators coming in and out, and most people understand why that is, but for those who don't, we have a lot of other hearings, a lot of other responsibilities. We get in a queue and kind of know when our questioning time is coming up. I decided that I would show up, albeit 11 minutes late, and stay because this is so important to the country and to me. But I think for those of you who have watched this hearing that was gavelled in at 10, what you've seen is a nominee who is extremely well prepared. We're used to seeing nominees who know a lot about a couple of things, and sometimes who know very little about virtually everything. But I think you've seen a hearing with a nominee who agree or disagree with the points he's made. He's not talking out of a briefing book. He's not having a thumb through a binder to decide how to answer a particular question. I've always been struck in working with Senator Rubio on this committee since I came to the Senate in January of 2013 that he has a very well-developed sense of the world and a passion and interest in all corners of it. I was particularly happy that he was nominated for two reasons. One, we have worked together significantly on legislation touching many different areas over the years, and one was referred to by Senator Shaheen, legislation to send a clear message that NATO and the U.S. participation in NATO is not just simply an executive priority that could come and go depending upon the Article II Commander-in-Chief, but it was also something so important that Congress would say that the membership of the United States in NATO is something that Congress would want to weigh in on should there ever be a decision by an executive that we should back out of NATO. And I think sending that message from Congress has been a very important thing that has led to a NATO that is expanding. Finland and Sweden, where the polling would have been de minimis 10 years ago for joining NATO, are now in. And I think a strong message from Congress is part of that. Obviously, the fear of Russia is a huge part of it, but a strong message of congressional support is part of it. I'm particularly proud that the Virginia National Guard has now struck a deal under the State Partnership Program where we are partners with the military in Finland, a very capable military. And the first exercises of the Virginia Guard with the Finnish military will start next month. I'm very excited about that. The second reason I was particularly gratified to see Senator Rubio nominated for this position is he cares about the Americas. I cast my first vote in a presidential election in 1976. I have not seen a single administration, Democratic or Republican, that has devoted enough attention to the Americas. We devote attention to it in a time of crisis and then move our attention elsewhere. It seems like secretaries of state have often thought that the world only has an east-west axis and not a north-south axis, and Senator Booker addressed that with his questions around the attention that should be paid by the United States to Africa. I feel that very strongly about the Americas. I don't have to ask Senator Rubio questions to gauge his interest and attention level. Everyone who comes before the committee tells us they're really interested in the Americas, only to find that they end up spending all their time somewhere else. I don't have to ask that question of this nominee to know that he has a passion about the nations that are our nearest neighbors, a passion about the nations who are so connected to us in our cultural roots and in our family ties. And it is so important, not just because China and other nations are now getting into the area. I don't want to have a new Monroe doctrine that we only care about it to keep Europe out of it. We only care about it to keep China out of it. We ought to be paying attention because we're connected to these nations, and things will go better for us if things go better for them. So to you, Senator Rubio, I'm very, very happy that you're nominated for this position. Two comments, then one particular question. One, the status of career ambassadors. I think it is a norm for every administration to ask ambassadors to tender their resignations, and it is certainly the norm for the political ambassadors to be politely let go the day that the new administration comes into place. And I think that's an expectation that everybody has. We get that. For the career ambassadors that are in place, they have been asked to tender their resignations to the incoming administration, and that's normal. But I would hope that the administration would consider, if their career, keeping him in place until their successors are ready. Because to swap out a career ambassador for a career chargé does not advance our ability in any way to operate in nations. There is a cachet that comes with being a confirmed ambassador that really helps you with continuity and diplomacy in these nations. So I know that that's a decision that the president makes, but I hope as you have a conversation with the national security and diplomacy team, you might encourage the administration, yes, you're going to replace the politicals with career chargés, but don't replace the career ambassadors unless or until you're ready to put somebody in place, which we know can often take quite a while for the administration to even forward nominees, much less the time to get through the committee process. That would be a comment. And then second is more for colleagues, really, rather than for Senator Rubio. One thing I've tried to be consistent on in my service on this committee is fight against unilateral executive application of military power unless it's in pure instances of imminent self-defense, active self-defense or self-defense against imminent hostilities. And I have been able to get this committee to pass significant war powers resolutions under 3 different presidents now. President Obama, a Democrat, President Biden, a Democrat, and President Trump, a Republican. And I just wanted to assure everybody that I'm going to continue to be a stickler that the nation shouldn't be at war without a vote of Congress, except in the instances of imminent self-defense. And I will do that because I have done that under presidents of both parties, and I'll continue. Senator Rubio, now to the question. And you alluded to this very briefly in one of the comments that you made about the nation of Paraguay. Not only do we not devote enough attention to the Americas, but when we do, we devote attention to the headaches. And the headaches abound in the Americas and elsewhere. And so we've talked about Haiti, a problem. We've talked about Venezuela, a problem. But so often we don't pay attention to lift up, elevate, provide resources to celebrate the nations in the Americas that are doing things right. And so when I travel through the region, and I'm sure you've heard the same thing, I hear these nations that are doing things right. Why won't you pay attention to us? Ecuador threw out a pro-China government, put a pro-U.S. government. All they wanted was a trade deal. We want to be closer to the United States. We're the only nation on the Pacific coast of the Americas that doesn't have a trade deal with the United States. This administration, I've been critical about the Biden administration, didn't do anything to advance that cause. Talk to us about some of the nations in the Americas that you think are doing things right and what we ought to do to help those nations, because we'll be much more likely to spread the right if there are other nations in the region that are doing better and better and better than if we're just trying to lecture people about how to improve.
Well, just as a general matter, one of the things that's always struck me is that the region, and then maybe this is true in other parts of the world as well, but particularly in the region, it's almost better to be America's adversary or enemy than friend, because there's the impact of friendship or the benefits of friendship are not tangibly clear to a lot of them. And you know, I've seen that expressed time and again over multiple years. And it's easier to pay attention to a headache. You're going to sanction, you know, some country that's not acting in anti-American ways, but the people that are sort of doing it the right way or want to be cooperative, they're ignored, and the countries that are doing it the right way are ignored. So I think there are a number of countries that right now as we speak, and I always say this with caution because I may not mention one country and they say, well, they left us out, but I just want to point to a few that I think are present and clear for us. You mentioned one with Ecuador. Ecuador was actually left out of CAFTA because at the time, the people in charge didn't want to be a part of anything with us. They're facing some real security threats that are unique to Ecuador's history. And they're facing these threats because you've got violence and gangs coming over from the Colombian border and then pushing up through Ecuador as a transit country, but they bring with it the turf fights and the gangs, and to the point where last year there was a real threat to the stability of the government, where they took over television stations and things of this, these armed elements did. And there's a lot we can do, and have done, but can do. Not a lot. We're not talking about a lot of money. We're not even talking about money in many cases, just equipment, to help them at least to restore some sense of stability. The other thing that Ecuador, these are just off topics, but I think they're all relevant. Ecuador faces a very significant challenge with illegal fishing off their coasts by Chinese fishing fleets who violate their territorial waters on an almost daily basis in massive quantities, and it's an ecological crisis as well on top of it. That's a country that can use our help tremendously. I think about the Dominican Republic. People don't talk about the Dominican Republic enough, and they face a real challenge because of Haiti and the instability next door. They were also one of the countries that emerged from COVID the fastest, and not just because of the tourism return quicker there, and they've really been able to do some positive things. I think Argentina, I know people, some have not met the new president of Argentina. This is a serious, well-trained economist. I would not, if you sit down and talk to him for a few minutes, he has real clear ideas about economic development and is doing some really necessary things in terms of restructuring the direction of Argentine economics in a way that I think is very positive.
Can I just say to every other nation out there that thinks you're a good guy, he was about to mention you, but my time has expired. But please focus on the good guys, and let's help them do better and better and better and be good examples in the region. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent point, Senator Keene. Excellent point. Senator Curtis, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. It's great to be with you today. Great to be on this committee. Senator Rubio, for the last 7 years, from a distance of about 600 feet, that's what separates the House chamber and the Senate chamber, I've watched and admired your work from a distance. And on a few, but very fortunate times, I've had the chance to actually be wind at your back on some of your work supporting Taiwan and protecting Hong Kong dissidents as we work together on some legislation. Now, in a twist of events, I sit not far from where you once sat, and there's another symbolic 600 feet between us, between the State Department and the Senate. And I'm excited to work with you in your new role. And I would like to continue to be wind at your back on a lot of issues, and none more important to me than China. And if you remember really nothing else about our short interchange today, please know that that's very important to me, and I hope to work with you on what I do with the aggression of China, and in many ways, their global push for military and economic supremacy, I think, is a threat in many ways. China is imposing, it's what they call China One principle on the world, which is very different than you know from our China policy. Can you kind of describe how we can push back on that and how we need to make sure we're shaping that conversation?
Yeah, and well, the first is to understand that the One China policy is, and the U.S. policy towards the issue of Taiwan has been consistent and reaffirmed by every administration since 1979. And it is the combination of the Taiwan Relations Act with the 6 assurances that make clear that the United States, we're not going to pressure Taiwan into any arrangement. We're not going to tell you when we're going to stop, or if ever. We make no commitment to not helping them in their national defense. We're not going to force any outcomes. And frankly, we are going to do everything, and we reject any effort to coerce, intimidate, and or forcibly drive Taiwan to do whatever China wants them to do. And that's been our position, and that will continue. That was the position under President Trump's first administration. I anticipate it will continue to be in the second administration. I think within that context, it's important for us to find every opportunity possible to allow Taiwan to engage in international forums where important issues are discussed, and they're not represented. Irrespective of what China claims about One China principle, they're not represented. And so the views there need to be made. They need to have an opportunity in these forums to be made clear. But I think stability is critically important. Here's the one thing I would point to here with regards to stability. If the Chinese are in fact serious about stabilizing U.S.-China relations and finding avenues of which we can be cooperative and avoid conflict, then they will not do anything rash or irrational when it comes to Taiwan or the Philippines for that matter. The actions they are taking now are deeply destabilizing. They are forcing us to take counteractions because we have commitments to the Philippines and we have commitments to Taiwan that we intend to keep. And so if they want to destabilize the relationship, or they want to help at least create some pathway for stabilization of our relationship with them, even as we remain engaged in global competition and in some cases more adversarial than others, they really need to stop messing around with Taiwan and with the Philippines, because it's forcing us to focus our attention in ways we prefer not to have to.
As a matter of interest, I actually lived in Taiwan in August of 1979, 3 months after that act that you referred to, and I think you're very accurate. I think for a minute about Europe, and there's some countries it feels like in Europe, because of their presence, Poland, Czech Republic, and Baltics, that are more in tune with this issue. But as a whole, it feels like some European nations are in denial of some of the things you've just said. You talk a little bit about how we work with our NATO friends over there and how we get them to appreciate this and actually play a part in this?
Well, I think in the case of NATO, I think I would expand it to really talk about the European Union and the EU, which I think is increasingly every single day coming to the realization of the threat that China's mercantilist policies and unfair trade policies are posing to them. They are flooding the European market with their cheaper electric cars, or attempting to do so. There's a dispute now about the importation of aluminum on sector after sector. You're seeing the EU confronting the reality. By the same token, you know, they're like many countries around the world, including ours to some extent, there's a quandary involved. There is an intermeshing economic relations that you can't just walk away from, but you also recognize the long-term threat that Chinese practices are having on your economic lives. And so I think that's an area in which the Europeans are, some more than others, are increasingly aware and willing to be more forceful. Italy has been willing to lean into it more than perhaps some other countries in the region. Hopefully that will continue to change. On the security front, look, an event in the Indo-Pacific, say, let's leave Taiwan out of it for a moment and say it's the Philippines. Okay, in the last 48 hours, there's this massive, I don't even know how to describe it, but this massive ship that the Chinese have built that's like headed towards the Philippines, and the Philippines feels threatened by it, rightfully so. We've seen this on a daily basis with the harassment and so forth, but on a daily basis. If, God forbid, there is some miscommunication or some inadvertent conflict emerges there, and we have obligations to them, the impact that will have on the entire globe, the impact that it will have on the entire globe is enormous, and that includes Europe. So they have a selfish, vested interest in seeking for the Chinese to curb their behaviors. I would also point to the Europeans that what the Russians have done with Ukraine would not have been possible without the assistance of China, whether it's the sharing of technology or aid in evading sanctions or selling their oil in secondary markets. The Chinese have been hidden, but clear to everyone watching, partners in the Russian endeavor.
Yeah.
And the Europeans know this, and they need to be continually reminded of it because it reveals the nature of who we're dealing with.
That was actually my next question, so I'm going to skip that one, but thank you for addressing that. I want to turn to Hong Kong. I mentioned I lived over in that area, and I actually remember as a young man in the 1980s shopping for a camera in Hong Kong. As a businessman in the 2000s, I tried to sell my product over there in Hong Kong. I've been over there a number of times as a tourist and just enjoyed that beautiful city. And unfortunately, today, none of that is possible. As a matter of fact, I actually have a warrant for my arrest over there because of the work in the house that I've done over there. Can you talk a little bit about the role there, and what's even worse is Hong Kong's now playing a role in facilitating sanctions evasion and money laundering. And can you address that issue? And
well, I think it's important to take 30 seconds down memory lane. Hong Kong was turned over by the UK with a strong set of assurances that it would remain autonomous and independent. It would be governed by the Chinese, but independent. They would have a democracy. There would be free enterprise. They would be left alone. In essence, they would, that's the promises they made. They have violated over time, they violated every promise. That is, they basically broke the deal. Just like they lied about all the island chains that they said they weren't going to populate and militarize, and they have done so as well. And so today, we cannot consider Hong Kong to truly be autonomous anymore. It is not. It is now under the full control, especially on national security matters, of Chinese authorities. And it should not be surprising to us that these deeply rooted banking institutions that are in Hong Kong, who long has served as financial capital on the global scale, are now being used to the benefit of the Communist Party and to evade global sanctions. And I think there has to be a growing recognition of that. I also think it's important to remind those sectors in finance that are still involved there that the Chinese national security law that's now been implemented in Hong Kong allows them, if they don't like what you're doing, to basically trump up any charges they want, go into your offices, raid the boxes, see all of your files, threaten to jail you, and they've done so in some cases. So it's no longer a hospitable place for people to conduct financial activity. So I think we have to call it for what it is. The notion that Hong Kong is now some autonomous entity that operates within China's system but independent of it and the decisions they make is a complete work of fiction.
yeah, and I hate to, I want one more quick question, but I also want to point out before we go on how good it could have been for Hong Kong and China had they kept that agreement. I think that'd been a whole lot better for China. Last question as we run out of time. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation about Panama in the news. Can you talk about the Chinese influence in the Panama Canal, what Americans should know?
Well, let me tell you, I actually didn't print a lot of, things to read like verbatim here, but there's one that I thought was interesting that I wanted to share, and I'm not going to put it out there for everybody, but the whole thing, but maybe I'll submit it for the record. But I just went through, this thing with Panama on the canal is not new. I visited there, I think it was 2016. I think I've consistently seen people express concern about it, and it's encapsulated here in quote after quote. Let me tell you, the former U.S. ambassador who served under President Obama said, the Chinese see in Panama what we saw in Panama throughout the 20th century, a maritime and aviation logistics hub. Just immediate past head of U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, said, I was just in Panama about a month ago and flying along the Panama Canal and looking at the state-owned enterprises from the People's Republic of China on each side of the Panama Canal. They look like civilian companies or state-owned enterprises that could be used for dual use and could be quickly changed over to a military capability. We see questions that were asked by the ranking member in the House China Select Committee, where he asked a witness and they agreed that in a time of conflict, China could use its presence on both ends of the canal as a choke point against the United States in a conflict situation. So the concerns about Panama have been expressed by people on both sides of the aisle for at least the entire time that I've been in the United States Senate, and they've only accelerated further. And this is a very legitimate issue that we face there. And I think I'm not prepared to answer this question because I haven't looked at the legal research behind it yet, but I'm compelled to suspect that an argument could be made that the terms under which that canal were turned over have been violated, because while technically sovereignty over the canal has not been turned over to a foreign power, in reality, a foreign power today possesses, through their companies, which we know are not independent, the ability to turn the canal into a choke point in a moment of conflict, and that is a direct threat to the national interest and security of the United States, and it's particularly galling given the fact that we paid for it and that 5,000 Americans died making it. That said, Panama is a great partner on a lot of other issues, and I hope we can resolve this issue of the canal and of its security, and also continue to work with them cooperatively on a host of issues we share in common, including what to do with
Thank you.
migration.
Senator, I'm out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Senator Rubio, I think that you're right about doing an analysis of the turnover documents, but I think even before that, we ought to do an analysis of the original documents that went into place, because they were very strong documents giving us control over a 5-mile wide on each side of the canal path, and was very specific. So I think a legal analysis beginning to end is critical. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member. Senator Rubio, nice to see you again. Thanks for taking the time with me, and thank you for being willing to serve. I want to start with the Pacific Islands. As you know, it's an area of focus of mine, and the Indo-Pacific is, look, we've been through several administrations, and they all say the same thing. They all talk about the future being in the Indo-Pacific, and that it's the most important region in the world. That continues to be true. My concern is that specifically when people talk about the Indo-Pacific, they're mostly talking about China. They may be talking about other East Asian countries, but there's very little conversation about Pacific Island nations. And we've got some auspicious things happening, but we've also got some challenges in front of us. The embassy in Kiribati is stalled. The Solomon Islands, as you know, are sort of contemplating making themselves available for PRC military forces. So we passed the Compact of Free Association. It's a bit of a mixed bag. And I'd like to just hear your theory of the case here about how to have some continuity. Obviously, it's a new administration. It's going to be a new State Department. But I think some of the things that have happened over the last 4 and even 8 years in terms of Pacific Island relationships have been good for the United States of America. So give me your theory of the case, not generally Indo-Asia Pacific, but specifically these small island nations with whom we want stronger ties.
Sure. So I think the first, obviously, is the ability to engage bilaterally with each of these individual nation states, you know, and that opportunity is already there. I think we should continue to build on it, and it's important and bears great fruit. I think the second, and it's an open question, which I certainly want the State Department to look at, and I think policymakers on the Hill need to consider as well, is, you know, we are dialogue partners in the Pacific Island Forum. And the question is whether we are fully utilizing that ability to be at the table in that forum. Now, you know, that forum includes Australia and New Zealand, which are bigger than some of these, but nonetheless important elements of it. And look, I think our expectations of the forum is, and they've had some internal friction with some of the member states, you know, about who's going to lead it and how the succession. So we hope they can work that out. But it's an existing forum, which I think could potentially, as a dialogue partner, provide us the ability to not just engage bilaterally with the individual nation states, but also collectively. And we may not agree on 100 million things, but there might be some things we can do through that forum. At a minimum, have a presence at it at a high enough level that shows our level of commitment and interest has been elevated even further, and then ultimately some real deliverables. I do think that given, again, we keep saying they're small, but they're important both because of geographic location, their presence in international forums, and I do think that whether it's the Millennium Challenge Grant, whether it's through the successor to OPIC, there are opportunities as well to leverage some private sector engagement from the American side and the U.S. side or the broader North American side on some of the, whether it's energy needs or resiliency needs or other development projects that they may have. So I think we have to explore that both bilaterally with individuals by ensuring that we have people there, but also explore whether we are fully utilizing the Pacific Island Forum as a dialogue partner to its full effect.
And you know that China engages in debt trap diplomacy, which can be effective for their needs, but it's usually, people get figured out eventually. And I think one of the areas where we can provide something that there's no other country that can provide is in the resilient space. In a severe weather context, we're really the only folks that really know how to prepare for, respond to, and rebuild from disaster. So, the United States Navy has always been helpful in this context, but that's something we should continue to focus on. So, staying in the Pacific, and I'm glad you mentioned the Philippines. My theory of the case here is that not that China has decided that its risk appetite is higher, but rather that the things that they are doing are not so risky at all. And that's because we have not been in a position to impose consequences. And I think one of the places where we have a good and growing partnership, and obviously bilateral economic and treaty obligations, is the Philippines. And in addition to the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and in addition to the Luzon Corridor economic partnerships, I'm just wondering how you see that growing democracy, one of our best allies on the planet, how you see that as strategically important for the United States.
Well, I think it's important. First of all, it's always been strategically important for the United States. Obviously, our military presence there diminished greatly as a result of some of the decisions that were made within the Philippines, but now you see a willingness to see us return. Look, we're not looking to militarize the Philippines, and this is not, I think it would be a mistake to solely view it as a security arrangement. There are long ties between the United States and Philippines that date back to 1899 in the Spanish-American War. And, and so I think it's important to build on that as well. I think there are real economic opportunities that we should be exploring. And so it's one that we need to show us a commitment. If I'll be frank, I think where this kind of fell off was, and I'm not getting involved in internal Filipino politics, but I'm telling you, during Duterte, it was a little tougher to work with them. And obviously there's some issue going on there internally as well. I'll leave that to their electorate and their politics to solve. So I think to the extent that over the last few years, you have seen a reinvigoration of American interests, it's not simply driven by the fact that the Chinese are harassing them. It's also driven by the fact that there's been a more welcoming attitude towards our posture and our position there. And that's one that when that opportunity presents itself, we should embrace, but then we need it to show results so that it becomes enduring. In essence, when your engagement with a country leads to economic development, whether it's outbound U.S. investment in the Philippines or what have you, then that becomes enduring. Then it makes it difficult, no matter who's in charge, to walk away from the alliance, because the alliance is more than just military and a military presence. It also involves jobs and businesses and investment and economic opportunity. And we need to look for ways to emphasize that. I think it would be a mistake to simply view it as a military or defense alliance.
Absolutely, and coming from Hawaii, it's the people-to-people ties that is the foundation of the relationship for sure. I want to talk to you a little bit about our approach on the Korean Peninsula, and I'm going to say something rather provocative. I think our North Korea policy is broken. I think it's broken on a bipartisan basis. I think CVIT is a fantasy. I think that the non-proliferation community wants to hold on to it for reasons related to other countries and non-pro priorities. But it's clear to me that it's not working. 10 years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room for suggesting that North Korea was able to develop maneuverable hypersonic warheads, solid fuel ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. But all of that has happened. 40 launches in 2024 and more launches yesterday. So I just like you, I know you're a hawk. I know you've been a strong supporter of sanctions. I never have opposed a sanction against North Korea in my life. But I just think that we need to look at this thing realistically and say, whatever it is that we have been doing, it's not working. These guys keep getting more and more capable. And whatever sacrifices they are making internally in terms of the suffering of their people, they got the technical capacity. Like I remember 10 years ago being told, well, they can do this, but they can't do a nuclear tip. Oh, they can range Guam, but they can't range Hawaii. Oh, they can range Hawaii, but they can't range the continent. They keep meeting and exceeding every technical mark that we think they can't make. And we are attached to a policy that is basically, it doesn't appear to be slowing them down in the least. So Is there an appetite for a rethinking of this, in my view, totally failed policy?
Well, I think there has to be an appetite for a very serious look at broader North Korean policies. And so I think it would be difficult for me today to come here and tell you this is going to be the official United States position on it moving forward, because I do think, because of the factors you've just pointed to, there's some things we have to look at in a broader perspective. Now, to his credit, President Trump, and look, I'll be frank, I was one of the people that was very skeptical about it, but he sort of reached out to Kim Jong-un, walked away from negotiations twice, ultimately didn't reach something enduring, but here's what he did able to achieve in that engagement, is he stopped testing the missiles. Now, that didn't stop the development of the program, but at least it calmed the situation quite a bit. I think what you're alluding to, and I'm not saying this is going to be the policy of the United States, because that policy is set by the president, and ideally set through a process that involves a bunch of stakeholders rethinking and being creative about it. But I do think what you're pointing to is the following. You have a 40-something-year-old dictator who has to figure out how to hold on to power for the rest of his life. He views nuclear weapons as his insurance policy to stay in power. Despite it means so much to him that no amount of sanctions has deterred him from developing that capability, and, in fact, has not even kept him from having the resources to develop it. Unfortunately, recent events now also have them engaged in conflicts beyond the Korean Peninsula, in fact, providing troops and weaponry to the Russians in their effort in Ukraine. And so all of this needs to be taken in conjunction and looking at the policy and seeing what can we now do that destabilizes that situation, that lowers the risk of an inadvertent war, be it between South Korea and North Korea, maybe including Japan at this point, and ultimately the United States. What can we do to prevent a crisis without encouraging other nation states to pursue their own nuclear weapons program? That's the solution we'd like to get to. And I just didn't bring it in my folder today because we're not ready to deal, but it's important.
And you got to involve the committee, and this is certainly multi-agency, multilateral. The president has to drive some of this, but I think none of this is possible without an acknowledgement of more than a decade of bipartisan failure in this space. And so if we can at least start with the premise that whatever we're doing right now is not working, we can start to work on something else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I got to say, boy, that sounds good, Mr. Chairman.
That isn't as good as it sounds to me, Senator. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 years working together.
Thank you.
And to Senator Rubio, let me say congratulations to you as well. We're going to miss you on this committee. We're going to miss you in the Senate, but you're going to do an extraordinary job at Foggy Bottom. And I will say if they capture you and tie you up in the basement, we will send a team to pull you out. As I look back over the last 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, there are a lot of policies that have done a lot of damage. Domestic policies, economic policies, but I think all of those pale compared to the damage that has been done to national security and foreign policy over the last 4 years. Over the last 4 years, this administration has systematically undermined and abandoned our allies, and it has systematically shown weakness and appeasement to our enemies. And the consequence has been disastrous. We've gone from 4 years ago, peace and prosperity, to today a situation with wars across the globe and every enemy of America stronger than they were when this administration came into office. I am confident the incoming administration is going to change that direction. I am confident that President Trump and the White House and you as Secretary of State are going to shift us back to where we should be, which is standing by our friends and allies and standing up to our enemies. Do you agree with that assessment? Is that what you intend to do as Secretary of State?
Well, let me say first, the foreign policy of the United States will be set by the president, and my job is to advise on it and ultimately to execute. I think the president has been abundantly clear, and that is his policy is going to be driven about making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. As I said in my opening statement, everything the State Department does, every policy, every program, every dollar it spends, every initiative it takes has to answer 3 questions. Does it make us safer? Does it make us stronger? Or does it make us more prosperous? And if it doesn't, if the answer is not yes to one of those 3, you're going to have a hard time moving that forward, because that's the priority that the president, and that's the priority that, by the way, voters gave this president when they elected him. You point to a number of things that I think are critically important, and I'll phrase it a different way, but I think we're saying the same thing. We have lost deterrence in multiple theaters around the world. So as an example, and I use this as a small-scale example, but it's really an important one. I think the year was 2020, 2019. The Wagner Group tried to get cute and came after some of Americans operating in Syria. And fire from the sky rained down on them. And that group was pushed back pretty hard. That's deterrence. They threatened us, and they knew what the response would be. I recall the consternation here and in other places when Soleimani met his demise. But I can tell you it impacted Iranian behavior for a substantial period of time. No matter how tough they talked, it impacted their behavior. I think it's important to reestablish deterrence. And to the extent that that's been lost for a variety of reasons, the lack of deterrence is an invitation to war. The lack of deterrence is an invitation to hostility. It prevents the very thing that we hope to achieve, which is peace and stability in the world. And I do think we've lost deterrence. And I think in some ways it contributed to what happened in Ukraine. An item I know is very close to you and you've worked very on, and we talked earlier today about, is energy dependence. I recall President Trump at both a NATO summit and at the United Nations, and I recall the United Nations one in particular, President Trump said Germany is entirely going to be left dependent on China, on Russia for its energy. And they laughed at him. There were diplomats in the hall that were snickering. That's exactly what happened. It is one of the reasons why Putin believed he could invade Europe, is because Europe would not push back because they depended on him so much for energy. Now, Europe is to be congratulated. They have moved very swiftly, particularly the Germans, to diversify their energy resources. But one could argue that we may never have had that invasion had that dependence not existed, because maybe who would have thought the European response would have been more forceful than he anticipated. So I do think reestablishing deterrence and strength is important, because it prevents war and it gives us leverage in diplomacy, where we hope to solve 99.9% of the global disagreements we hope to solve through diplomacy, not through armed conflict.
I think that's very well said, and I want to give several specific examples. Number one, you and I are the only two Cuban-American senators. You're about to leave me as a lonely sole member of the Cuban-American caucus. Thank you for that, Marco.
There's 3 Cubans. They always call it a conspiracy. So
now I have no one to play dominoes with. But look, issues of Cuba, both you and I share family stories of parents who fled oppression and came here seeking freedom. As you know, as you talked about earlier today, this week the administration delisted Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. I think it was an absolutely shameful and reckless decision. I think it was a political decision on the way out. I think it was designed to hamstring the incoming administration. I am unequivocal that I think the Cuban government are evil communist bastards. Given your new job, I suspect you might be slightly less forceful in saying so and slightly more diplomatic, but I know you're hard on the question. But let me ask you this. Do you believe Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism?
Without a question, and I'll tell you why. Number one, the FARC, which is, elements of the FARC and the ELN for that matter in Colombia. These are narco-terrorist organizations, and have been. They started out as ideological organizations and now figured out they're Marxists, but they want to make money selling cocaine. So they've done that. They have had the full support of the Cuban regime throughout their entire existence. We know that Cuba has been friendly towards Hamas and Hezbollah, openly friendly towards Hamas and Hezbollah. We know as well that the Cuban regime, for example, hosts not one, but 2 countries' espionage stations within their national territory, 90 miles from the shores of the United States, and that provide valuable insights and cooperate with these elements. We know that they have strong ties to Iran as well, and the terrorist elements associated with them. And we know for a fact that there are fugitives of American justice, including cop killers and others who are actively hosted in Cuba and protected from the long arm of American justice by the Cuban regime. So there is zero doubt in my mind that they meet all the qualifications for being a state sponsor of terrorism.
Well, it is clear you're going to be confirmed to this position. You're going to be confirmed with an overwhelming bipartisan vote. I think it is likely you'll be confirmed on January 20th, on the first day the president is sworn in. When you are confirmed, I think it is also likely, I hope on that very first day, you will reverse that determination. You may not feel prepared to make that commitment now, but is there anything you want to say on that?
Well, I would just say, again, I don't want to speak ahead of the administration's these decisions. As I said, the president sets our foreign policy, and my job is to execute it. That's how our system of government works. I would just remind anyone on this recent deal with Cuba that just happened over the last 12 hours, nothing that was agreed to is irreversible or binding on the new administration. And I think people know my feelings, and I think they know what the president's feelings have been about these issues when he was president previously. And nothing that the Biden administration has agreed to in the last 12 or 18 hours binds the next administration, which starts on Monday.
Good. Let's turn to Israel. In the last 4 years, this administration has been the most anti-Israel administration we have ever seen. They have systematically undermined the government of Israel, particularly at a time of war. The Biden State Department secretly asked other parts of the administration to suspend anti-terrorism sanctions so they could pour unaccountable hundreds of millions of dollars into the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. They refused to implement mandatory congressional sanctions against Hamas terrorists for using human shields. They made incredible efforts to secretly circumvent mandatory congressional prohibitions on money going to the Palestinian Authority because of the PA's support for pay to slay. Even after October 7th, they secretly poured millions and even cash from American taxpayers into Hamas-controlled areas. Meanwhile, they secretly implemented boycotts of Jews living in Judea and Samaria through the Development Finance Corporation and binational science and technology foundations. They secretly manufactured files used to impose crippling financial sanctions on Israeli Jews and refused to provide those files to members of Congress. Those sanctions were renewed just yesterday. I have every confidence that President Trump and you will reverse these policies broadly and specifically, but I'd like to ask you about some of them quickly. Can you commit to ending anti-terrorism sanctions waivers related to Palestinian terrorism and implementing sanctions against those terrorists?
Yes.
Can you commit to ending discriminatory policies, including Biden administration's secret boycott policies against Jews in Judea and Samaria?
Yes.
And can you commit to reversing the discriminatory sanctions against Jews living in Judea and Samaria?
Again, yes. I think that the policy of, again, without speaking out of turn, I'm confident in saying that President Trump's administration will continue to be perhaps the most pro-Israel administration in American history.
And the final question, you and I talked at great length about the 1944 water treaty with Mexico. Mexico is in violation of that treaty. It is doing enormous damage to South Texas. Farmers and ranchers there are experiencing drought. As the Secretary of State, tell me what the State Department can do to encourage and incentivize Mexico to comply with the treaty and provide the water that they are obligated to provide to the people of South Texas.
I think raise it in every engagement. We will be engaged with Mexican partners. We have to engage with the Mexican government, and it's important to elevate it and raise it at every one of those engagements. And I don't just mean like sending a letter or somebody sending an email or just mentioning it. I'm saying making it a priority, and it's a priority not just because it matters to Texas. It's a priority because these international agreements and arrangements only work if they're complied with. And if they're not complied with, and it becomes habitual, other nations believe they can begin to violate them as well. It undermines this entire commitment to multilateral agreements and so forth. And I think it's in the crevices of those agreements, whether they've been in place for a long time and no one's paying attention anymore, or it just doesn't matter enough and you ignore it because you don't want to destabilize the rest of your relationship, but it encourages it to happen more and more. It is not the only irritant we have in our bilateral relationship with them and in our agreements. I imagine they have some with us as well. But it's one that needs to be prioritized and raised consistently as a priority, not just as an asterisk or a footnote.
Thank you, and you're going to do great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say, Senator Rubio, I want to start off by noting for the record that when I first got to the Senate and I was in my first year and you just run for president, and I didn't think you would know who I was. I was pregnant with my daughter and trying to change Senate rules so that I could bring her onto the floor so I could do my job and vote, because I can't come through the normal back door to vote because there's stairs there and it's not accessible for wheelchairs. And I remember in the middle of that battle, rolling through the Senate floor to vote, and I heard, "Tammy Duckworth," from across the Senate chambers, and you came running down from the top back of the Senate chambers to tell me, "I'm with you, I will support you, you have the right to vote, and I will support you being able to bring your daughter, your child onto the floor when she's born." And I want to thank you for that kindness, because you did speak to your leadership about it. And it was a moment of true bipartisanship, but also as parents. And as someone who was new to the Senate, I was extremely grateful to you for that kindness.
I think what I exactly said is, what's the big deal? This place is already full of babies.
Exactly. So I want to touch on a topic we discussed last month. Thank you for sitting down with me. I always appreciate the opportunity to sit down with nominees. I appreciate also your earlier response to Senator McCormick about Americans detained abroad and your commitment to tackling this head on. As you and I also discussed last month, I appreciate your attention and commitment to addressing the case of Illinoisans in particular that we discussed as well. Thank you for that. Another topic, you already touched on some of the issues in the Indo-Pacific, particularly around the PRC and the DPRK, but I'd like to dive back into the issue of ASEAN and the ASEAN nations. Since coming to the Senate, I make a point of visiting Southeast Asia annually to reinforce our friends and partners there, and those that we want to become our friends and partners there, that the United States, and particularly those of us in the Senate, care deeply about these long-standing historic relationships and making sure that those relationships live up to their potential. And as you know, respect for ASEAN centrality has been a core part of our foreign policy in that region. In fact, the first Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy correctly emphasized ASEAN centrality as an important principle. Unfortunately, not all of President Trump's nominees this time seems to grasp the importance or in fact know what ASEAN is. Yesterday, I was distinctly unimpressed when questioning Secretary of Defense nominee Hegseth that he could not mention a single nation in ASEAN, particularly shameful when we have at least two major non-NATO allies in the bloc, one of which, Thailand, is the longest treaty alliance that the United States has at over 190 years long. What can you share with us today about how you would approach ASEAN as a whole and with individual member states to capitalize on some of the key opportunities and challenges facing the region? I know you've spoken about the Philippines, but can you build on that?
Sure. ASEAN, the first thing is, the group's utility begins by the fact that through its 10 members, they've also, I believe, have 5 or maybe it's 6 free trade agreements now with neighboring countries as well. Look, we have to be very pragmatic in our approach and how we prioritize it. I think the group will always struggle to coordinate unanimity on the issue of their relationship with China. Okay, if you look at the continental, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, because of their geographic presence, because of history, they lean a little bit more in the Chinese direction, and other countries do not. I think it would be a mistake for us to sort of make it as a condition of our engagement with ASEAN to say, you must pick a side, and you must pick a side now. Are you with them, or are you with us? I think what I can safely say is that the overwhelming and vast majority of the nation states in ASEAN, if not maybe all, do not want to live in a region in which China is the predominant power and they are viewed as tributary states to Beijing, and welcome U.S. engagement in the region as both an economic and defense counterweight. And so I think we need to view this as, it would be a mistake to go in with sort of a Cold War mentality of pick a side and pick a side now. I think the broader approach is to say they have a vested interest in us being involved. We have a vested interest as an Indo-Pacific nation in involving ourselves through this forum and finding opportunities, both holistically through the 10 nations and individually through whatever bilateral opportunities present itself. Earlier, you may not have been here, but I was asked a question about Thailand, and there is a group of Uyghurs that are in Thailand that they're saying may be deported. And I said, this is one of our strongest, longest relationships in the region, and maybe one of the longest and strongest in the world. And that's where these relationships really come to bear, not to browbeat them in a public forum, but through strong diplomacy and using the benefit of that relationship to go to Thailand and see if we can't get them to not deport these people into the hands of Chinese authorities, knowing the atrocities that have been committed. So that's a value added to this relationship. That is a bilateral relationship we have with Thailand. It's not the one we're going to have with every country in the region, but I do think the forum serves as a useful platform for us to be able to engage the region and individually these countries.
So you would agree with what the first Trump administration emphasized, which is that ASEAN centrality. And I think this is something that the new ASEAN chair, Malaysia, under Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, is saying with the Mandani concept, which is growing that cohesion within ASEAN itself and in dealing with the organization while we continue to pursue those bilateral relationships. But the stronger ASEAN can be cohesively as a unit, allows them to better deal with countries like Myanmar, for example, and allows us to better have those relations with them, and also for them cohesively to try to stand up to outside forces.
One of the things that I think, and I think you saw this in the first Trump term, and we'll probably see again, is to the extent you see production sort of moving from China to other countries, some of these countries stand to benefit from that, assuming they themselves are not the target of some tariff or what have you. But I think there are benefits there in that regard. I would imagine that there are also some concerns they would share with us about maybe some of our other policies, economic or otherwise. But I do think it's an opportunity that provides some real economic development benefit opportunities for a number of the countries in ASEAN. We would hope all of them, but certainly some more than others because of alignment of interests. What I do think is we have to be realistic, and I just want to reiterate this because I think sometimes we go into these things viewing them with the lens of NATO or something else. The key component to understand is we are probably never going to have sort of a overwhelming majority consensus on the role China is going to play. But I do think you could argue that the vast majority of countries in this forum, if not all, do not want to live in a region in which China is the predominant, overwhelming power, and they all are viewed as sort of tributary states. They are not interested in that, and they view the United States as a very logical and welcome economic and defense counterweight to that.
Yeah. And I do think that even the mainland ASEAN nations that, as you, in your words, are lean more towards China, have suffered. If you look at what happens with water, we talked a lot about Mexico and water into Texas, but also with the Mekong River in ASEAN, with the 10 dams that China has built upriver is now affecting water and also arable lands further down the river. And initiatives like the Two Rivers Initiative, which marries the Mississippi River, which is 2/3 of the border of my home state, along with the Mekong River, is a way for us to build some of these relationships and bring in American expertise. A different place where we can also provide expertise is international disability rights. We have been working with ASEAN on developing disability rights and a cohesive approach to it in ASEAN. But I think on an international scale, whether it's ASEAN or Ukraine as they rebuild, I do think that disability awareness, rebuilding Ukraine to become more accessible, promoting disability rights around the world is something that is a way that we can engage with the rest of the world as well. Love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I say this
commitment to disability rights around the world.
And I say this, sadly, it's going to be of critical importance to nations that are emerging from conflict, where we know modern conflict, people are injured in ways that are now survivable, but leave them for the rest of their lives with permanent disability. And so I think it's going to be, in the case, from a very practical perspective, in the case of Ukraine, it's going to be valuable because there are people that have been injured in that conflict that for the rest of their lives are going to have to deal with that, and it's conducive. The other thing we've discussed is our diplomatic facilities around the world and whether they are, and understand that the number one job, the reason why we have embassies and consulates, yes, we represent U.S. interests in that country, but its number one obligation is to support Americans. If you lose your passport, if God forbid you go to jail, whatever it may be, that we have a presence there that can support Americans abroad. And it was stunning for me in our conversation to learn that there are a number of these locations around the world that are not accessible to Americans with disabilities that needed to access them. So it's something that we would have to look, we'd be interested in looking at as well to make sure that just from our core obligation, we're able to fulfill it.
And also it keeps many of your own staff members who may have disabilities from serving in some of these overseas missions. As you said, highly trained, well-qualified regional experts, subject matter experts may not be able to serve in some of these embassies where they can't it's not accessible for them. So I thank you for bringing that up. And I will yield back my 9 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So generous.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator Duckworth. Those are important points. Last but not least, welcome back, Senator Lee, to the committee, and appreciate you've had your work cut out for you today in your new role as chairman of your committee. But the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Senator Rubio, for your willingness to serve in this position. going to make a bold prediction and say that you are likely to be confirmed. That's my prediction. I can't speak for others, but I believe that nonetheless, and it's a bittersweet moment. I'm back on the committee after 12 years of being away from it. You and I came to this committee and to the Senate at the same time, both in our late 30s, the youngest members of the Senate at the time, although you have me by exactly 7 days, 7 days older. Notwithstanding the fact that you were the older between us, you've got all of your hair, and it's not a single gray hair in there. But I've deeply enjoyed working with you as a colleague and getting to know you as a friend. We have kids that are about the same age, and I've watched yours. I miss having you here, not only as my Spanish teacher, not only as my source of Bible insights and my source of comedic material, but also for your great insights on foreign policy, domestic policy, and everything else we do here. You've just been great to work with, and you will be missed in the very likely event that you are confirmed. Let's talk first about the Western Hemisphere, an issue that I know is near and dear to your heart and mine. And we'll start with the Panama Canal. President Trump has recently talked a little bit about the fact that there are some questions arising about the status of the Panama Canal. When we look to the treaty at issue, the treaty concerning the permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal, we're reminded that some things maybe aren't quite as they should be there right now, given that the Chinese now control major ports at the entry and the exit to the canal. It seems appropriate to say that there's at least an open question. There's some doubt as to whether the canal remains neutral. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, and yes. Here's the challenge. Number one is, look, I want to be clear about something. The Panamanian government, particularly its current office holders, are very friendly to the United States and very cooperative, and we want that to continue. And I want to bifurcate that from the broader issue of the canal. Now, President Trump is not inventing this. This is something that's existed now for at least a decade in my service here. I took a trip to Panama in 2017. When on that trip to Panama in 2017, it was the central issue we discussed about the canal, and that is that Chinese companies control port facilities at both ends of the canal, the east and the west, and the concerns among military officials and security officials, including in Panama at that point, that could one day be used as a choke point to impede commerce in a moment of conflict. That's going back to that. But before you got here, and I don't want to have to dig through this folder to find it again, but basically cited that how the immediate past head of Southern Command, just retired General Richardson, said she flew over the canal, looked down and saw those Chinese port facilities and said, those look like dual-use facilities that in a moment of conflict could be weaponized against us. The bipartisan China Commission over in the House last year had testimony and hearings on this issue, and members of both parties expressed concern. The former ambassador to Panama that served under President Obama has expressed those concerns. This is a legitimate issue that needs to be confronted. The second point is the one you touched upon, and that is, look, could an argument be made? And I'm not prepared to answer it yet because it's something we're going to have to study very carefully, but I think I have an inkling of I know where this is going to head. Can an argument be made that the Chinese basically have effective control of the canal anytime they want? Because if they order a Chinese company that controls the ports to shut it down or impede our transit, they will have to do so. There is no independent Chinese companies. They all exist because they've been identified as national champions. They're supported by the Chinese government, and if you don't do what they want, they find a new CEO, and you end up being replaced and removed. So they're on the complete control of their government. This is a legitimate question, and one that Senator Risch had some insight as well. He mentioned that in passing, that needs to be looked at. This is not a joke. The Panama Canal issue is a very serious one.
And so the mere potentiality of that, the ability to exercise that control, even until such time as they do it, as they do shut it down, is a concern, is it not?
Well, I listened 48 hours ago to FBI Director Wray in one of his exit interviews he gave to the press, and he said the Chinese are embedded in our utilities and critical infrastructure. Now, he didn't say every single day they're shutting off the power in the United States. He said that if there's a conflict, they're embedded and they could shut off the power in key places. We've all identified that as a threat. The fact that you can do it You don't have to do it every day. No one's claiming that the Chinese are shutting down the canal every day. What the claim is, the very legitimate concern is, that if these companies control both ends of that canal in a time of conflict and the Chinese tell them, shut it down and don't let the U.S. go through there, we got a big, big problem, a big economic problem and a big national security and defense problem. The ability to do it alone is a threat. We shouldn't ignore it. It isn't a joke. It's a legitimate issue, and it needs to be solved.
Excellent. And that feeds right into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which it just involves areas of dual-use capabilities throughout the Western Hemisphere. Ports, infrastructure, critical minerals, and so forth. We've had policies from the Biden administration involving the supercilious use of untargeted foreign aid and sort of cultural coercion in order to persuade them to, or in an effort to coerce some of these countries to adopt policies that are contrary to their established cultural norms, abortion rights, LGBT policies and curriculum, and so forth. That probably hasn't helped in this conflict, in this still somewhat soft conflict in which many of these countries are opening their doors to China. I can't imagine that will have helped. How will your approach to Chinese incursion in the Western Hemisphere be different from those of the current administration?
Well, there are a couple points. The first is the Chinese incursion in the hemisphere involves, number one, investment of dollars. Like, as an example, they go into some country, they say, here's $5 million or $10 million to build a stadium, but in exchange, you have to let us build out your 5G network using Huawei, safe cities, and the like. And by the way, here's a couple $1 million for you and your friends as a bribe. Okay, that's their first level of engagement. They go in and then in some ways they create deals that you can not possibly pay back. So now you've got a debt that you can't pay back, and they have you trapped. And now they've got your vote at the UN and your cooperation on X, Y, and Z. And that happened in Panama, by the way. In 2016, 2017, that was well understood that part of the investments they made in Panama were conditioned upon Panama's ability to convince the Dominican Republic and other countries to flip their recognition away from Taiwan. That happened. So that's number one. The second element of their involvement is they go into a country and a Chinese company will buy up the lithium mines or access to the rare earth minerals in these long-term contracts. And that exists in allied countries. The Argentines will tell you there are a number of business deals that the Chinese and Chinese companies have gotten a hold of in Argentina that even if they wanted to back away, they can't get out of the deals because of the way they were structured. So that's number two. And then number three is their presence. The Chinese are actively involved in military installations in the Western Hemisphere on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from our shores. Only a few hundred miles from where Space Force operates and NASA and Cape Canaveral. Only a few miles from MacDill, where we have Central Command and Special Operations Command. Only a few miles from Southern Command. Only a few miles from Eglin Air Force Base and the test range we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. All of these things, this is real, and it's operating right off the coast of the United States. They have a presence in our region. So we have to acknowledge that this is happening, and then we have to be present and have counters to each of these, and/or there has to be consequences for each of these. Fortunately, the United States has strong relationships in multiple key countries in the region, and I think we have the opportunity to build upon that and in ways that can attract the sort of investment that they would rather have than the Chinese investment. But right now it's not available. It's not happening. There is no American alternative to what the Chinese are offering. So hopefully we can provide the openings for that.
Indeed, and I appreciate your enthusiasm and thoughtfulness in providing that answer. Now, you touch on another issue when you reference the significance of agreements made by prior administrations. Obviously, the Javier Milei administration in Argentina wouldn't have been as likely to enter into those arrangements as his predecessor was. In the United States, we have to keep this in mind. The Constitution, of course, allocates the treaty-making and binding power. It spreads it out between two branches. The president can enter into a treaty, can sign a treaty, but that treaty isn't ratified unless 2/3 of the Senate does it. So it flips the usual legislative process because it's a different type of legislation. Would you agree with me that that type of arrangement, which is submission of a treaty after the president has entered into it, after the president has signed it, the submission of that treaty to the Senate for ratification and the ultimate ratification by the Senate is a necessary precondition for an international agreement to be binding on the United States of America?
to be binding beyond the administration that entered into it. This was the case of the JCPOA, which was being sold to people as a treaty, but it wasn't. And the reason why it was a political agreement. It's basically a political arrangement between the current administration and the regime in Iran, and that's why President Trump had the authority to pull us out of it when he did. I think what's important to understand about treaties in general, and we talked about treaties here today with Mexico. There are a number of other treaties that people may not be aware of. Every treaty, by definition, okay, is a surrender of sovereignty at some level as a nation. But you do it and you enter into it. Why? Why do you enter into a treaty even though you're surrendering some sovereignty? Because you've concluded that that surrender and the benefit of it to the national interest or the national security far outweighs the surrender of sovereignty and the consequences of it. And that is why it's so critical that the Senate be involved in that deliberation, because an individual administration may get that calculus wrong. But when you have this overwhelming majority that concludes that it too agrees that that surrender of sovereignty is exceeded by the benefit of the treaty, now you know you've increased your chances of have something that's good and makes sense. And so I agree with your view of it. And I think that's the way I would hope we would pursue arrangements in the future if we enter into any.
That's why it takes 2/3. Thank you so much, Senator Rubio. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rubio, we know you have an appointment at the White House at 3 o'clock. Senator Shaheen has one brief question for you. I have a couple of brief remarks, and then we'll get you on your way.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Rubio. I think that was a very impressive display of your knowledge of the global situation. But the one area that you mentioned, but we haven't really talked about, is the Arctic. And given what's happening in the Arctic and China's designs on the Arctic, can you just speak to what you think our posture ought to be with respect to the Arctic?
Well, we're an Arctic power. The Russians are legitimate Arctic power. The Chinese are not. Whether they're near Arctic power or I don't know what the term they came up with to give an excuse for them to be up there.
Crazy.
I think, frankly, I know you didn't ask me this question, but it's one I welcome the ability to talk about in some of this discussion with Greenland, putting aside all the things that are going on in the media. I think we need to understand that Greenland has been strategically important to the United States and to the West for a very long time. In fact, in 1941, at the outbreak of World War II, the United States was signed up as a protectorate, even though the Denmark had been occupied. You think back into I think Harry Truman tried to buy Denmark. Harry Truman had made an effort to try to buy it for like $100 million. He was rebuffed. And then the U.S. has maintained, through the mutual defense agreement there, the opportunity to base itself, to have military bases, and it had them for a while. Why? The reason why is because of where it's located geographically. Yes, the access to the minerals on Greenland are critically important. But as more navigable space is opening up in the Arctic, particularly this northern passage that goes from Russia to China, Russia to Asia, and could cut transit times by as much as 40%, the Arctic is going to become incredibly critical. And so we have to have a presence there. We have to have a presence there, not just saying, okay, we have a base, we have 200 people, or we have a flag flying. We have to have the ability, for example, to have the ships that can navigate on the naval level and keep those shipping lanes open if, in fact, they're being threatened. We have to have partners along the Arctic region that will join us in ensuring that the Arctic region is open for free and flow of navigation as these passages open up, because global trade is in many ways going to be infused by it. We have positions within the State Department that I think in the past have been diminished or people just haven't paid a lot of attention to. I just had this conversation the other day with Senator Murkowski, that all of a sudden I think people are interested in serving in Arctic affairs and in Arctic posts, because this issue of Greenland has opened our eyes to the broader geographic importance of the Arctic region, which long has been a curiosity or something people have not talked about. But I think now we have the opportunity to see it for what it is, and that is, one, if not the most important, one of the most critical parts of the world over the next 50 to 100 years will be whether there's going to be freedom of navigation in the Arctic, and what that will mean for global trade and commerce.
Thank you. I'm going to order that Senator Rubio's responses, written responses to the questions regarding his relationship with his committee be filed for the record. I'm also going to order that the letters in support of Senator Rubio's confirmation be entered in the record. And finally, I want to say thank you, Senator Rubio, for providing us with the benefit of your testimony, your responses, and your knowledge. It was outstanding. This committee takes oversight of U.S. foreign assistance extremely seriously. You know well that transparency and accountability are paramount. To that end, I want to flag for you my work with the Office of the Inspector General on the State Department's Bureau for Global Health, Security, and Diplomacy, PEPFAR, and the Biden administration's failure to uphold long-standing United States laws protecting life in global health assistance. In addition to my request for an investigation, I've been holding over $1 billion in U.S. foreign assistance since September of last year, and will continue to do so until I can be sure that not one single American tax dollar will be used to perform or promote abortions overseas, as that is required by U.S. law. I look forward to working with you on this, in addition to the many issues that we discussed here today. Finally, I will note for the information of members of the committee that the record will remain open until tomorrow, Thursday, January 16th at 1 p.m. For members to submit questions for the record. Thank you. God bless you. We wish you well. Committee is adjourned.